Usually, I try to do very big, comprehensive interviews. With you, I do not want to beat you over the head with a lot of stuff that you've talked about. I read your book, Be Pure, Be Vigilant, and I didn't know you had another book, 2000 AD, the creator of Judge Dredd, until like 2 days ago. So I only made it about halfway through that. But then there's also Future Shock, and I got that, and it's got the great extended interviews with you. So I don't want to beat you over the head with that stuff. I'd love to talk a little bit about just the creation, of how you got into comics and then building up a little bit through action and battle and all of that. But mostly what I'd love to concentrate on is you and O'Neill and your guys' kind of relationship going forward, and how martial law is to me an extremely important comic series. The series is constantly underplayed by critics, but if you talk to fans, it is something they are rabid to know more about. So that's kind of what I would love to dive in with you here about. Does that sound kind of
Sure, sure.
all right? If there's anything that you'd like to talk about as we move along, just mention something. If I'm beating a dead horse to death, let me know. Like I said, I tried to watch a ton of interviews, but you've done so many, man. And there's just so much incredible information out there about you. I want this to be something new and interesting for you rather than retreading old ground.
Okay.
So, obligatory question, gotta ask. I've been doing a lot of research about British comics. As an American, I don't know an inordinate amount about it, and I just recently found out about ballast books and stuff. So I was curious how you got into comics, actually.
Okay. Well, I guess I kind of got into comics almost by accident or almost by mistake. I worked for a publisher in Scotland, and they were what you might call the leading publisher of popular culture in every shape and form, ranging from magazines for elderly women to nursery magazines for preschool children. And so, of course, inevitably, they would also include comics. So I worked on a teen magazine, a teenage girls magazine called Romeo that included comic strip. And that was pretty much my, I suppose you could say, my sort of first experience or first real experience of comics. Because growing up, I wasn't a particular fan. There were odd comics that I liked, but I was far more interested in cartoons. And these could range from American cartoons like Esquire or Mad Magazine to British cartoonists like Ronald Searle, who created a series called Centrinians about crazy schoolgirls. It was hugely popular in the UK, but I don't think it really ever made it across to the States. So you could say that cartoons are pretty close to comics. Mad Magazine is very close to comics. And so, there's the connection, if you like. And having seen these comics in action on Romeo and seeing how they were done, it struck me as a good genre to try. I don't think at the time when myself and my colleague John Wagner, who went on to be the writer-creator of Judge Dredd, I don't think we were especially interested in comics per se. We just wanted to make a living. We just wanted to, like most freelancers, what's going to sell? And we did sell other material, but if you like, at that time, there was a gap in the market. Nobody wanted to write for comics. Now that sounds really odd. Do you know what I mean? Today, where there's a lot of appeal. But believe me, at the time, certainly in the UK, nobody wanted to write comics. So they were seen as a very lowly kind of thing to do. And, but you could make money doing them. And one also, just like anything that you do in life, you have to make the best of it. So even though it lacked what you might call the prestige that it has today, you look for ways to do something with it that maybe nobody else has done before. And I think that's the prime influence, not just on myself, but also on John Wagner. And so that's what we did. And I think that influenced everything else that I did subsequently.
Speaking of subsequently, you know, you went on to do, that's funny that you kind of fell into comics because you are, at least as an American, and I must say that my view of comics from anywhere outside of the US is very limited because just coverage and information isn't that easy to come by. But especially growing up in the 80s, during the rise of Dread, I mean, your name was synonymous. It was the single name that came to mind for me when anybody talked about comics outside of the US. Eventually, I would find guys like Toby and Mobius and stuff, but really, you're the guy that I think of. And it's really, really interesting to hear that you fell into comics like that since you've played such a pivotal role in evolving the medium, not just where you were from, but also across the sea, which is something that not many people can claim. You know, more can claim that a few guys, but can you talk a little bit about how battle came to happen and that kind of thing?
Sure. Well, I think, I suppose the first thing was that British comics were in decline when John Wagner and I started work on them. And I think nobody liked them. And so we kind of rebuilt them in our own image, primarily because no one was telling us anything different, so we could do what we liked with them. And that's a great, looking back, that's a great creative opportunity. Everyone around us basically thought at that time that British comics were dead. They thought they were finished. And they had a very personal reason for this, which was if they were finished, they got their redundancy and they went off somewhere else. So it was in their interest to do so. And there is also another thing that few people will admit or acknowledge, but I think is very important. There is, I mean, this is broad brushstrokes and being very simplistic, but there's an upbeat quality to America. You guys think you're going to sock it to everyone, you know what I mean? In Britain, it's not like that. To say we're self-deprecating is probably an understatement. People who are too upbeat, too confident, too what would be seen as arrogant, would be seen as entirely normal in America, like, what the fuck's the problem? It would be very different. So our kind of upbeat approach, people really didn't want British comics to succeed. And the only area where they did want them to succeed, and this is going to lead me into a little bit of a minefield, was fandom. Now, fandom was actually very corrosive at that time. It was not a positive force in British comics. American comics, sure, you know, these are the kind of guys who would know Steranko's work and all the American underground comics. Is it the East Village Other and all those kind of things, Robert Crumb and so forth. But we were aiming at children. And so the net result really was that fandom could be a negative force on that then and even now, because to appeal to a 12-year-old kid is very different to appealing to a 20-year-old or an 8-year-old. A 12-year-old is very smart, but he's still discovering his world. And that was the audience we were reaching. And if you tried to promote a kind of fandom approach to them, you might appeal to a minority, but to the majority, they would say, oh, I don't get that. Because fandom has elements of what we would call today art house. And what we're talking about are ordinary kids who are often incredibly smart, but they also have a kind of short attention span because that's that stage in their lives, you know. You want a quick fix of comics or books or music or whatever. You don't want to sit there and, as we both know, comic fans will look over every picture and do a lot of chin stroking on it and so on. 12-year-old kids, thank God, aren't like that. So it's against that background that we did Battle. And Battle, I think the one thing that would stand out from it is that it was, in very broad brushstrokes, anti-establishment in a relatively subtle way. There were no officer heroes. Now, I mean, that's probably reflected near enough in the States where, you know, you have Sergeant Rock, right? It's not Captain Rock or General Rock, it's Sergeant Rock because, you know, he's an ordinary guy. He's a guy from the streets. But in Britain, where we are so class-ridden, and the clock's gone back in recent decades. So for us to have stories which were primarily about ordinary, or you might call it blue collar or working class soldiers, was relatively different to what our opponents were doing elsewhere. And it's one of the reasons for the success of it. And my own story in particular, Charlie's War, about a soldier in World War I. He's just an ordinary kid. He's not a superhero. And yet his adventures were more popular than what you might call the more muscle-bound soldiers. I know you have an equivalent tradition around that time in the States where you had stories about the Vietnam War and so on. Archie Goodwin, I think I'm right in saying it had been Blazing Combat or something of that kind, where they were, I think Archie in particular was making some very striking comments at a time where that war was very meaningful for anyone who lived in the States. But for us in Britain, I think, particularly with Charlie's War, to make this point about World War I being a disaster was unheard of. So that was Battle, if you like. And then moving on from Battle, I went on to do Action, which was very, very much a street comic and had a very, very strong following. I'm trying to think if there's an equivalent culture in the States, possibly a very inner city audience of kids in particular. And this was a time where that social group was finding its own identity. And it was very different, if you like, to perhaps, I say very different, it was overlapping, but it was different to the audience that liked Battle because their dad or their grandfather was in the war and they wanted to know more about the war. And also, as you know, in Britain and the United States, both countries are obsessed with World War II. They're endlessly extolling how they won the war, never mind what the Soviet Union did. You know, that was, well, it didn't really count. You know, it's United States and, you know, Finding Private Ryan and all the rest of it. So Action was very much a street comic. but it also had strong elements of very British, a very British approach to things, and perhaps also more importantly, in very simplistic terms, there were all these movies that came out from the States, some of which kids could not see, like Dirty Harry, Magnum Force, and probably Jaws was probably not suitable for the younger audience. And we were supplying them with stories that reflected that kind of Dirty Harry quality. And we had a character, Hookjaw, that was the most popular. I mean, it's a fish. A fish was a fish beat every other comic book story. Can you imagine, you know? But the reason it was so successful was, first of all, it was brilliant artwork by a Spanish artist called Ramon Sola. And, you know, it's not everyone, even amongst all the distinguished artists you have in the States, not everyone can draw a fish and make it the star of a story. And, you know, that really does need commending him for. What a great achievement. We were so lucky. And so the other thing from the reader's point of view was there was something very satisfying about it. It was a scaled down version of Spielberg's masterpiece, because what it meant was every week, I mean, bear in mind, we're a weekly comic, so it's a very different mentality to the United States, where you can have slower stories, 22, 23 pages, and things can evolve and so on. You can have a certain amount of talking heads, right? No talking heads in action. that's, you know, we are catering for readers with a relatively short attention span. So you've got 3 pages of Hookjaw, and he has to eat someone in those 3 pages. So the whole focus of the story is who's going to get eaten this week, and how is he going to get eaten, and how are we going to make it different to whoever got eaten the previous week. And that involves a certain, it might sound very shallow, but it does actually take some writing skill to make that work. And so that was action. And I set up action, and like Battle before it, as a freelancer, I always wanted to be free of the pressures of being a staff person. Once you become a staff person, they own a bit of your soul, and that was not for me. And so therefore, I passed it on to an editor after it was successful enough. And then he'd had enough of the company. As I say, there was a big movement to just get out of comics, really. And it went on to someone else who was not really in a position to know how far to go. And this is perhaps relevant because I doubt very much you would have the equivalent anecdote in in American comics. I mean, this guy had previously been an editor on nursery magazines like Bobo Bunny and Now I Know and Fun to Learn. And suddenly he's the editor of this bloody comic aimed at inner city kids with a shark eating people every week. And so whereas I intuitively, after a fair number of years in the business, know, okay, we can go that far, but no further. And that would be risky, but that would be okay. You know, it's something you just know and learn by experience. He didn't know when to stop. And the poor guy, really, I mean, it's an impossible position to put him in. And so the comic ran away with itself. It became very violent and it got banned. So that was the end of the story of action, I'm afraid.
I knew it only lasted, I think, 7 issues, but I'd always wondered why.
Oh, no, it's longer. No, you probably 7 months is what you're thinking of.
7 months, yeah, thank you.
7 months, yeah. It's probably 7 months. So that's a lot of weekly episodes. And they were all, some of them were spectacular. And the covers, I think I think for anyone at your end who's curious, you know, if you Google action images, you don't know, you may or may not get into the stories because they are very intense. You know, 3 pages of black and white with a lot happening, a complete story in 3 pages. My God! But nevertheless, the covers are worth looking at because they have a lot of thought, a lot of soul, and a lot of blood. I mean, they are, in their own way, they are little masterpieces. And a lot of that is down to my art editor at the time, a guy called Doug Church, who would later very much inspire the visual look of 2000 AD. So what I take away from Action really is the wonder of those covers. And also, it was a lost time in the 70s where I would say inner city working class kids had a voice, not just on Action, but in various novels. There were a lot of novels and films around at the time. The American parallel would be things like Clint Eastwood films, but there were a lot of homegrown British films as well that had a very 70s feeling. And there've been echoes of it in the 80s and 90s through to today. But I think the 70s was their high watermark. You know, you had, maybe it ran into the 80s, a film called Scum, which was about boys in a prison. You had, for the very first time, for a post-war generation, you had stories by novelist Sven Hassel about German heroes, which was unheard of. I mean, after all, you know, for us baby boomers, we grew up with this, you know, imperialism of Britain, as well as the United States winning the war. And then suddenly, for the very first time, you have German heroes. What that tells you is that there is a counterculture that is challenging the status quo. And that's really what Action was doing. And that was ultimately why it got banned, not for one particular image or another, but because the status quo is not stupid and it knows when it's being challenged and it doesn't like it. And so it wasn't that difficult to find a way to get it banned. Arguably, if I'd remained editor, I'd have probably given them a damn good run for their money, because subversion is my, as we'll probably go on to talk about with martial law, subversion is what you might call my middle name. It is what motivates me as a writer. I mean, the reason why is perhaps open to question, but whereas some people are motivated by, what shall we say, a love of superheroes, they might be motivated by a love of money. For me, what makes me tick is a love of subversion. And I think Kevin O'Neill, but we'll get on to him later. But as we're talking about Action, so if you like, everything that followed, some of it is there in Action at this early stage.
I absolutely agree. When I went back and read it, one of the things that did pop out to me, aside from the fact that you guys were capable of telling cogent stories in 3 pages, which as an American is it boggles the mind. I mean, I can't think of anybody in the U.S. Well, there's several editors out at DC who get a lot of flack because they come from the old era. But when I heard them speak about what they did when they got new talent, was they would throw you on their horror titles. And I always wondered, how did all of these guys get launched out of horror titles? And they all said, if you can write a good short story, something tiny, minute, that is capable of keeping a 12-year-old's attention, then you will be much better suited for tackling any type of subject material. And
exactly, that's it can be an art form. It can also be debased, and probably the ways it gets debased or got debased probably fall outside the American experience, but I'll mention one of them just to show you what we were up against. There was an assumption, which was grotesque and unfair, that 12-year-olds weren't very bright, which is horrible. So this meant that everything had to be spelt out. And there was a discipline at the Scottish publisher that I worked for, which was known as front seat of the stalls, where you're seeing things like you're in the front seat of a theatre. You know, now if you consider that all the artists that both you and I love, you know, one of the reasons we love them is because of the crazy angles, the up angles, the down angles. And, you know, I mean, like here, you and I are talking and we're in a front seat of the stall. So you imagine comics where it's just front on the whole time. It would be bloody boring, and sometimes it was. So that was one of the things that we had to change. But there was a bad habit that we picked up, and I think it took me a few years to get it out of my system, which was when the artwork was poor, and some of the artwork was poor because there were no royalties, so the financial incentive to produce quality was not there. So what this meant was that artists would just knock stuff out and they might not draw things very clearly. And now I'm exaggerating here, but so therefore the script writer had to compensate for the weaknesses of the art. So he might even have some dialogue, and this is a bit silly, but something like, who is that man who's just walked into the room with a submachine gun? Because you can't see he's got a submachine gun. So the dialogue compensates for weak artwork. And of course, this leads to the most constipated and stiff dialogue. It's like solid oak on occasion, because you're having to ensure that the reader knows what's going on. I mean, in retrospect, they did, and we did not treat them with the respect that I think they were due. And so it was unlearning and discarding that old way of looking at things. It takes time, because you can go too far the other way. I mean, if you look at a fan favorite story, for example, it can be so stylish, you show it to a 12-year-old and he may not even know how to look at it. He's saying, well, I don't get it. What's going on? Because it's all so understated and so art house and so slick. So it's finding a balance between those two polarities, really.
That is incredibly interesting. I had never been able to pinpoint why some British comics did feel a bit stiff, because I've been trying to really explore more avenues and just educate myself on the medium. And that's really interesting. And it is one of the things that I definitely keyed in on your work. And I think obviously played a very large part in the next big thing that you would do, which of course was 2000 AD. For any viewers who are curious to learn about 2000 AD, let me say up front, Mr. Mills has a book out that
are we on audio or just video or
both?
Ah, okay. Well, then here's the book. Yeah.
Be Pure, Be Vigilant, Behave is absolutely incredible. I didn't get a chance to pick up the print version because I couldn't wait for it, so I got the audiobook and was extremely pleasantly surprised to find Mr. Mills did it himself, and it is a great read. It's absolutely filled with incredible facts about how 2000 AD happened, a lot of the characters. And then there's also a follow-up that he did, 2000 AD, the creator of 2000 AD and Judge Dredd. That's also available as an audiobook on Amazon. I will have links in the description below to both the print and the audiobook, so you guys can check those out. I'm sorry, but I'm not going to beat him over the head with questions that he answered in books that you can buy for a very reasonable price if using the links in the description below. We'll talk just a little bit about 2000 AD. Mostly what I want to hit on is your relationship with your writers and artists. You know, obviously You have some very long-standing relationships with guys, most notably John Wagner, Kevin O'Neill. John Wagner, you know, you had worked with him previously, and both as freelancers, and then you guys went on to 2000 AD. Like I said, I don't want to beat you over the head with starting 2000 AD, and you can talk about what you think would be relevant about those experiences here. But I think a lot of American viewers might not be aware that John Wagner, the creator of Judge Dredd, did depart from 2000 AD for a while fairly early on, and you were extremely pivotal in many of the stories and elements of Judge Dredd that most American readers have become extremely familiar with. Can you
Yeah,
talk can you talk a
sure.
little bit about your transition from those early magazines over to 2000 AD?
Sure. Well, I mean, I suppose the problem really was we were both John and I were always struggling for the right financial deal, and I think even to this day, I don't think we've ever really entirely succeeded. And so John had this idea for a kind of Dirty Harry cop and a futuristic cop who was really just would shoot someone for some minor misdemeanor. And I found that kids really liked these extreme characters. And we were very influenced by, I think it's Manning, East Village Other, an underground cop story. And we thought, it's that kind of extremism that will work. And we saw it as a kind of satire on fascist cops. And I'd written another story, an occult story about a character called Judge Dredd. And John felt that this occult story wouldn't fit a science fiction comic like 2000 AD. So he asked if he could have the title. And I said, sure, yeah. So we had this title, we had an idea, and then Carlos Esquerra, who was very influenced by growing up in Franco's fascist Spain, produced this sensational character that was actually far, far beyond anything that John and I imagined. And progressively, we almost had to live up to the art. And I would go further, and I think there's a complacency, I think, about comics generally, where we might say, oh, we have lived up to that, to Carlos's image. I would disagree. I think there are elements of Carlos's original imagery, in particular his architecture, that none of us to this day, to my knowledge, have ever lived up to. In other words, he was drawing buildings that I wouldn't call skyscrapers. I would call them star scrapers. They were like mile high or something. And the science fiction that would go with that, I don't think any of us at that time were quite up to realizing. And as I say, it's a very messy origins. And I'm a little comforted by the fact that I gather that in the States, you have similar, rather messy origins with characters like, you know, Spider-Man was that, how much was Stan Lee, how much was it the artist? And I gather this goes across a number of things. Well, it was even messier, I think, with British comics. And I think the only positive thing about it is that I think we've all been very upfront about the messiness. I don't think any of it is in dispute. None of us are saying, no, that's not true. You know, Judge Dredd was created in a very, very strange way. There was one writer who came, I mean, I'd written the first episode to appear in the first Judge Dredd story ever. And I wasn't entirely happy with it, but I thought, well, it's halfway there. Because John had got pissed off with the lousy financial deal and had rightly walked off the set. And, you know, why not? I mean, as a fellow creative, I do this kind of thing myself. So I fully admire anyone who says "fuck you" and walks away. You know, that's cool in my book, because it gives me a license to do the same thing. So I was desperate for writers, and then I found this guy, Peter Harris, who wrote one story, and he created the whole Judge world. It's all there in Peter Harris's story, and so I said, right, forget my story. I'm going to go for this one. And Peter just did this one story and disappeared. And years later, I think he's passed away. He has passed away now. But I always make a point of acknowledging his role because, you know, it was so pivotal. And if you like, my role was pivotal in as much as I chose what was going to make Judge Dredd. In other words, right, we're going to have a bit of Peter, we're going to have a bit of John Wagner, we're going to have a bit of Pat Mills, we're going to have a bit of someone else, and a lot of Carlos. And then after this chaotic period where John came back to the story, and then he wrote these amazing stories from round about the from about 3 or 4 months in, maybe 3 months in on 2000 AD, and then, you know, he reclaimed his own creation, and those stories are sublime, and all the kind of edginess that he would describe to me in conversation finally comes out on the script. And, you know, if that all sounds rather tortuous and so on, as you doubtless know, that's actually what creating stories are about. You're going to go through first draft, second draft, third draft. You come up with this idea initially and you think it's great. And then after a break, you think, actually, that's a bit shit. That this needs changing and that needs changing. And maybe the only difference, perhaps, with American comics is that I kind of get the feeling that more of that happens behind the scenes, right? But in British weekly comics, you're seeing it, you know, all our dirty laundry is all hanging out there. All the things we got right and all the things we got wrong and all the cock-ups, it's all there to be looked at. And I don't think any of us felt that kind of embarrassed about that, because we recognized that, particularly with the poor financial deal and our rather lowly place in the world of publishing, well, so what? You know, this is how we've got to do it, and there's always that grinding deadline. You know, I mean, a monthly deadline is tough, but you imagine a weekly deadline where you've got to say at a certain point, okay, never mind the arguing, never mind whether he should have his gun in his boot holster or under his arm or whatever. It's got to go. It's got to go out the door. Not something that sits comfortably with me, which is why I stayed with the comic through the. Then eventually I thought I have to move on, because if I stayed, I would have had to compromise. And to this day, compromising does not sit comfortably with me. You know what I mean? I think a lot of creators are like that. They don't compromise. You know, they're going to hang on in there. It's got to be right. Whereas I think certainly with rather more ephemeral weekly comics, sometimes you've got to use McDonald's as your role model. You know, it's fast food. It's got to get out the door. And I can't do that. It's not good for me.
That's a wonderful analogy. That is a wonderful analogy. Some incredible stuff came out of 2000 AD, and I think the best thing about it is that it was kind of uncensored. But I think, you know, like you said, a lot of it was, well, we gotta fill out some pages this week, guys. So what are we gonna do? Let's throw some stuff in here.
Yeah.
And it's always a pleasure to hear you speak, because your integrity when it comes to your work is very apparent. And when reading your inordinately large body of work, it does become quite apparent that when you reach a point where you're no longer interested or invested enough or given enough freedom to do what you want with the series, when that constriction becomes too tight, you just simply part ways. There's no
Yeah.
anger or ambivalence or name calling or anything like that. And that's a huge difference with American comics, because yes, a lot of this stuff does happen kind of behind the scenes, but then once that floodgate breaks, it gets really, really ugly. There's name calling, there's nastiness, and Dread is an internationally recognized symbol, not just character. And whenever I hear you speak about him, it makes me infinitely happy, because you bring up everyone involved. And you mentioned like Stan Lee and Spider-Man and stuff. And I did a whole video on Stan and Steve Ditko and the fallout of that situation, and Stan Lee writing a letter when he was in his 70s. Yeah, Steve Ditko is the co-creator of Spider-Man, and there was ulterior motives to even that. It was sickening the way some of that stuff plays out here in the States, and that's something that I think you guys have always dealt with much more intelligence and an even hand. So I
Yeah,
just wanted to.
I think that's true. Um, I mean, being a little cynical about it, one of the reasons might be, and we have yet to discover, because we have yet to, both Dread films didn't make a lot of money, right? But if they had, if it's, you think about it, in the States, the characters you're talking about, there's a lot of money involved. And so therefore, that can, now I'm not sure that we Brits will be any different to you guys. If there's a lot of money involved, that could bring some ugliness with it, maybe. But because for the most part, you know, nothing, I mean, you know, we've had the two Dread movies. It doesn't look to me like there's any prospect of a third Dread movie or a TV series for Netflix or anything like that. There's a lot of talk about it, but as you doubtless know, or my theory on this is, if nothing happens within about 18 months of an announcement, you know it's just hype, or at least that's what I go by. I'm happy to be proved wrong, but I think it's the case. So I think Dread is currently cold. I think other projects like Rogue Trooper with Duncan Jones, again, it was some 2 years, maybe longer, maybe 3, since it was announced, or the possibility of it was announced. And so again, I feel it's gone cold. But what that means really is, for the most part, that no one's going to get rich. So there's nothing to argue about. But if it were other, you know, and I could see how that could create a lot of intensity in American comics. I read an article about in Hollywood Reporter, whether you doubtless know the one, it was quite recent, and where they were saying a line which I've used in my as a chapter heading for my new book, which is about slaying. It's called Kiss My Axe. But I was particularly struck by the phrase, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And it was one of your top American writers said that.
Jim Starlin.
Was
Jim
it? Yeah,
Starlin,
okay. Yeah. And so he got the grease, apparently. So there's a lot more at stake. I mean, there's large sums of money and so on, but I have a feeling, I hope I'm wrong, because I would love to be proved wrong. It'd be good for me personally and financially. But I have a feeling the parade has moved by, you know, it's moved on. And I'm not aware at this moment in time of any movement on any British films or TV things. We've had a lot of close calls. We got that close, but no cigar. So it looks that way, and it's disappointing. And again, when we come on to martial law, we got even closer with martial law. We got to the Warner Brothers boardroom. So, but we can get onto that later. But yeah, but no cigar. So I've kind of, I guess you have to be philosophical about these things, and you have to say, okay, there's more to life than money, although money is it's always very pleasant, and you have to feel fulfilled in what you're doing. And I think the stories that I write these days are very much, they are fulfilling, and somewhere down the line, I think what goes around comes around, and I think we will get another shot at it somewhere down the line. And whenever that happens, it could be decades from now. But I think when it does happen, for God's sake, let's get it right this time. Because somehow or other, I wouldn't know that the ball was fumbled, but I mean, it's not really the fault of the original, of the comic or the creators when a movie goes wrong. But I mean, in fairness to American comics, you guys have got it right on Marvel films. I mean, they're making a ton of money, and presumably something similar where DC is concerned. So, you're tapping into the vibe of the whole thing. And we just haven't done that. We didn't do it with those two Dredd movies. Fans will say how brilliant the second movie was, and they hate me when I remind them that it didn't make the requisite amount of money. And that's got to be looked at, or rather, why didn't it? And it's all very well saying, yeah, well, it was because it was 3D, or it was the wrong time of year, or there was a rival film. All that could be, I would say, could be argued against any number of, superhero films. There's factors working against it, and they got it right. And I'm not a big fan of them personally, as you know, as we'll get on to with martial law, but I admire commercial success. I admire creativity where they say, okay, we want to reach this audience, and this is how we're going to do it. And if they succeed, well, they've got my admiration,
I think the Dredd movies are moving in the right direction. I know a ton of fans, speak about how good the second Dredd film is, and I'm one of those guys. I went and saw it at the theater, and my goodness. But and I get the feeling that probably one of the big problems that film actually faced was being a little bit ahead of its time. It's sad to say that, but I can tell you, I went into that film with exceedingly low expectations following the Sylvester Stallone movie. And I was blown away. The fact that he insisted on keeping the helmet on, there was a lot of elements that I thought got carried over from the comic. I don't think it quite had the heart that the comic ever did. I think a lot of the story kind of got lost in translation. But I feel like it was a step in the right direction. And just from a guy who interacts and is kind of obviously a part of the fan community, I can tell you that we all are rooting that 10 years from now, when another one happens, or 5 years from when it does happen, because it will happen, because he's a great character and he's not going anywhere, you guys will be given just a little bit more input. Because I think that's you talked about Jim Starlin, and the squeaky wheel gets replaced. They have had him on set. They've asked him, what would Thanos do? How would Thanos act? Josh Brolin, the guy who played Thanos, he talked to Starlin. Nothing like that has happened for any of the Dredd films. And
no, you're right. I mean, John Wagner was a consultant on the second movie, but my understanding was in a very indirect way. He wasn't. It's my understanding it wasn't that kind of intimacy that you're describing. But of course, then there's the other element to it as well. Well, there's two things for me. First of all, you've got to say, and British fans have a problem with this. They recognize it. Look, the person you've got to appeal to is an American kid who's what, 20, 21, something like that. That's who you've got to appeal to. And he may or may not have heard of Judge Dredd. He'll know the whole Marvel universe, but he may know his dad may have talked about Judge Dredd, but for the most part, he doesn't know. So he doesn't have that affection that perhaps comes if you're into Lord of the Rings, where you've read the book and therefore you can't wait to see the movie. You haven't got that back factor there. So it's got to work on its own terms. And then we come to the second thing that I think is sad that it was ignored, which is that the early Judge Dredd stories that are very associated with John Wagner, well, there's two aspects to them. One is there was a heroic story that I wrote called The Cursed Earth, which really focused on the heroism of Dredd. So that's one thing that you can focus on. He has to be a real hero. There has to be a hell of a lot at stake. Now, from memory, you don't feel on the second Dredd movie that there is a heroic struggle where there is an incredible amount at stake, where you're thinking, he's got to get this vaccine or whatever it is from A to B. He's got to deliver this because he's got to save the city. There isn't that sense. And that was the quality that I brought. Now, what John brought, and they were both equally successful in different ways, was he brought this comedy element to it. I mean, which was very much John's personality, and it's a very Scottish humor mixed with a kind of with his American origins as well. I'm sure that's in there as well, in a way that makes his writing quite unique. And he so that all had that comedy, which got discarded because, and it's totally irrelevant now and out of date because of what RoboCop 1, where I think it's now a matter of record that they kind of, what should we say, gazumped certain elements of, they took certain elements of Dredd and made it their own, and so on and so forth. But that was a lifetime ago. I mean, no one remembers that. And there's all this rich comedy, but to write comedy drama, and this again will bring us back to martial law, to write comedy drama is bloody difficult. It's harder, it's much easier. I mean, that second Dredd movie is hard, fast, tough action. But there's lots of guys out there who deliver hard and fast and tough action. And even, I would argue, and not all fans will agree with me on this, but Carlos's original creation, the uniform, was bonkers. It was insane. It was Baroque. You know what I mean? It's a fantasy costume. And that's, for me, is one of the delicious aspects of comics, is we give movie makers a nightmare. Create this. So, okay, if you rationalize it down into a sensible costume as it was rationalized, okay, that's cool. But there's a lot of American cops who look, even modern day ones, who look scarier. And if they don't look scarier in the States, I can tell you that in Europe, you look at Serbian cops or French riot police or something, they look scarier. So, these things are being lost along the way, because when people first looked at Judge Dredd, they think, my God, who is this guy? And why has he got an eagle on his shoulder? I mean, it's so, it's so ludicrous and so wonderfully ludicrous. It's why we love comics, because they take a step into the bizarre and unknown in a way that a novel or a regular film will not. So for me, all those things, and in particular comedy drama, because if you can make this 20-year-old American kid who's a novice to Judge Dredd, if you can make him laugh at the ridiculous technology and the ridiculous future world, you've got him, you've hooked him. And that's how we hooked our original audience, with that unique humor of Judge Dredd. And I think we, as you know, we went further down that road on martial law, And, you know, I think if we, and we'll get on to that, but I mean, it's very much a combination, not just of the comedy that I would bring to the table, but also Kevin O'Neill, who is a great humorist for all the reasons that many people are great humorists, because they have a, what should we say politely, a cynical attitude to the world, you know?
And speaking of O'Neill, in '78 you did there was the Star-Lord magazine, and you did Robusters for that, which was the beginning of that kind of like mini universe that you and Kevin O'Neill made. There was ABC Warriors, and then Nemesis the Warlock was the other
Nemesis,
one, right?
all kind of interacting around this. Yeah, yeah, that's yeah, just like everything on 2000 AD, it was kind of a very messy process of creation. But what you have out of it are these incredible robot designs in Robusters and ABC Warriors, where I think those robot creations of Kevin have never really been equal to this day. You know, I've written ABC Warriors into recent years, but I don't think any subsequent artist has created anything as powerful as Kevin's original designs. And, you know, and this gets us into territory, which again, I think in the States, judging by that Hollywood Reporter article, things are acknowledged that you have a creator and then you have a developer. And I think as long as everyone's properly paid, it's fine, you know, and as long as, you know, as long as nobody is shortchanged or is cheated. So often you would have these original designs, these original creations by Kevin, and another artist would come along and they might add full color to it, and they would add digital painting. I'm thinking of Clint Langley, and it would take these things on several stages. You still have the creation, and it's the same with Carlos. You have Carlos Ezquerra's original Judge Dredd, which is sensational, but then you have an artist like Brian Bolland coming along and taking it, moving it on several places. It's fantastic development, and in a way, arguably making it more accessible, perhaps, for certainly for an American audience. It's a more accessible style. And sometimes these things have to happen. And I think as long as everyone is properly acknowledged and remunerated, hey, that's modern comics for you.
Can you talk a little bit about how you originally got hooked up with Kevin? You guys have done a lot of work together over the years, and and that's another thing, you know, your relationships with people have been fostered over long periods of time, and even when you guys take breaks away from working with each other, you'll come back. And I've always thought that said a lot about you as a professional as well as a person, because that's not something you see a lot in comic books in general. Usually bridges are burnt pretty quickly, and when people stop working together, they just simply fall out of contact. But that's not the case. And I was curious how your relationship with Kevin started and how it's evolved over the years.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, Kevin was the, we needed an art editor for 2000 AD, and Kevin came in initially as the assistant art editor and then became the art editor of 2000 AD, and you can see his imprint on all those early issues. And what Kevin brought to the table there, and I think we all recognized it straight away, was this dark sense of humor. In other words, he, you know, even from his very earliest work, he always had this great sense of comedy. And he was also very much into robots. And so, you know, he did several solo projects, and then I think he designed the characters for Robusters. And this is the thing that, this is why things sometimes seem very jerky there, where, you know, you find Kevin drawing for a while, and then he stops and someone else takes over, and so forth. It is because like so many really creative people, you know, he puts all that energy in. I mean, look at the detail on his work, especially in well, in Nemesis, where you've got these this incredible city of termite, which is Gothic in a style that I don't think anybody. It appears to I can't think. I mean, you could say with Carlos, maybe his mega city owes something to Gaudi. I mean, you know, maybe a little, although I still think it's pretty unique. I mean, I didn't make the Gaudi connection until a few years ago. But in the case of Kevin's Nemesis world, it's so bizarre. It's truly unique. You think he hasn't been influenced by anyone. This has come out of his head. You know, this is astonishing. So, but the creativity involved in that means that he's not like a lot of artists who can stick with a schedule. In other words, they're gonna knock it out week after week after week. For Kevin, it's a journey, I think, into his own inner consciousness. He's producing these incredible images, and so therefore, I think, you know, inevitably other artists would take over on those stories. And, you know, that's something that I think has been ultimately beneficial to those stories, because it's given them more status rather than they're something short and ephemeral. But I always feel when I think about Kevin's work, it's not that he's a frustrated writer, because I don't think he has any great desire to write normally, but I've kind of drawn that out of him, because I would often find, especially on martial law, that he would be making suggestions on things, and I would really feel that it often went above and beyond an artist suggesting things to a writer. So I've encouraged him in recent times to that you know, we've written a few text things ourselves and so forth, as much as anything, but as an outlet for his dark humor and his creativity, and I think that's probably been valuable for both of us, really. Yeah, I mean, I suppose probably martial law, as far as comics are concerned, marks the high water mark of our relationship together, because this was a story. I mean, one of the big problems was that Kevin was not earning enough money for the kind of, I mean, if you're spending, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 days over a page of artwork, which you're going to get paid peanuts for, it's just not economic. And there does come a point where you've got to say, look, we're not going to subsidize publishers anymore. They've got to pay the going rate, or, you know, we exit stage left. And so martial law, by comparison, paid well. And of course, it provided an outlet for Kevin's encyclopedic knowledge of superheroes. He knows everything about them. And I know very little, other than I don't like them. So I would endlessly have to consult him in that direction and say, you know, who was so and so on, and so that was a process on that, if you like. And but yeah, so it brought tremendous comedy to the character when we did martial law together. And there's two schools of thought on that, and it may even be a kind of little bit of a division within martial law fans as to whether they like the more humorous ones, which are more outrageously taking the piss out of all kinds of well-known characters, or the earlier dramatic ones where the comedy is still there, but it's a little subdued compared to the the drama. And from a cinematic point of view, I mean, I think there's a place for both, but I think the days when you could have a movie like Airplane are long gone. You know what I mean? You know, I mean, I love Airplane, and I could see martial law being done like that, but convincing a studio of that's a tough call. So they're going to go for, you know, a story with a strong beginning, middle, and an end. And if you look at the very first martial law story, that's got all those elements. It's got the drama and so on. And that's the one that I think we've been optioned a few times as a movie. And that's the one they invariably go for. But at the same time, I think both Kevin and I still carry a torch for the kind of Airplane type stories. I'm thinking of the second, was it the second or, yeah, I think it was the second story, Martial Law Takes Manhattan, where he's entering a lunatic asylum where all these well-known superheroes are having therapy, and they all commit suicide in the most grotesque ending. And that's such a wonderful scene, and that owes a great deal to Kevin. Yeah.
Martial Law is an incredible series because it did start off as just extremely biting satire with like a backlying element of parody comedy, and that moved kind of the forefront, and things have really evolved with that series over the years. It's always incredible to see, you know, every few years whenever a series would pop up, you'd be like, ooh, what's this one gonna be like? Because they were always different, they were always fun to check out. Before we dive like super deep into Martial Law, like the one thing I did want to ask about, I recently did a video on Garth Ennis, and I had occasion to go back and explore Crisis. And Crisis was that magazine was incredible. I absolutely loved your work for it, and I was wondering how involved were you with Crisis, because I just haven't been able to find much information about it here stateside.
Yeah, well, Crisis was a weird one. My God, to put it in context for your readers, because yeah, the possibility of getting hold of a copy of Crisis is pretty thin. Do you know what I mean? And you know, you don't want to go on eBay and pay some insane price for it. It started off, it wasn't my creation. They asked me if I wanted to do a story about what was then called the Third World and Third World hunger. In other words, developing countries and how they were experiencing famine and so forth. Now, this sounds in the year 2021 as very dry for an audience, but that's a sign of maybe how we've moved on, because when it came out in the late 80s, early 90s, whatever it was, teenagers were really passionate about world hunger. They were really wanted to know about it. And I'm sure that was just as true in the States as it was in the UK. So it might seem like I'm getting on some kind of political soapbox, and I'm sure I was, but it was a subject that people were interested in. And what interested me was, how can I dramatize these events in a way with strong heroes and so forth. And anyway, so that story was married up with another story, which was, it was a bad marriage, because the other story was called New Statesman, and it was obviously incredibly influenced by Watchmen. Now, if you're into Watchmen, you want to see more Watchmen, and maybe you want to see more New Statesman, but you don't want to see a story about third world hunger. It's a completely separate thing. So you've got these two things stuck together that really, one of them is going to miss out, one of them is going to lose. And that's unfair in a way to put them. The assumption was at the time, this is a measure of, you know, I kind of get the feeling, and I'm probably wrong, that in the States, people don't make these kind of crazy publishing mistakes. Maybe they do, I don't know. But in Britain, we seem to make a lot of them. Let's put it like this. We don't seem to quite understand the audience, which pisses me off, because my background is I made a point of understanding them, not because that I'm more talented or anything. It's just simply, right, who is my audience? How am I gonna persuade this 12-year-old kid to buy my comic? And everything else for me is subordinate to that. So you've got these two forces that are irreconcilable. You know, in other words, you've got what could be seen perhaps a little unkindly as a Alan Moore knockoff, combined with this very political story about third world hunger. And so unfortunately, the new Statesman story didn't work, and it, you know, it ended. And so then they needed new writers to come along. And out of the blue came Garth Ennis with, I think, Troubled Souls, I think it was. And this was, this had the, I mean, bear in mind, we're all spinning around this kind of genre of stories for, what should we say, 18, 19-year-olds, for students, people who are aware of their world, and they want stories to reflect this. And I think Garth, his story very much hit that button. And so that was taken on board. And then I think maybe there was another story as well, somewhere down the line. For my part, on my side, and it's something I often volunteer talking about, and I'm not expecting you to get into it because we've got an overview on this, but for the most part, no one's ever looked at the significance of this, is that what I thought was, okay, we're going to have this story about a bunch of teenagers who are involved in this kind of Peace Corps, if you like, you know, like the American Peace Corps, where they go and maybe they do good things in developing countries, but certainly in this story, they did not do good things. It was almost a kind of Vietnam War sensibility. They were conscripts. So what I did was I had a group of, I think there were 6 teenagers, and I based every single one of them on someone I knew. But I took it further than that. I actually had access to all those, they weren't necessarily teenagers, they might have been in their 20s or even older, but I had access to them. So what I would say to them in this, when I was writing an episode is, okay, you're in this situation, there's a dead body on the road. What would you do? Now, we all assume we would react in roughly the same way and go, oh my God, call the cops or whatever. But it's surprising how if you ask 6 different individuals how they will react, each one will react in a slightly different, nuanced way. So I felt very confident with my characters, because they were all not just based on real people. I was actually using their dialogue and saying, okay, tell me what you would say in this situation. And the remarkable thing is, it will always surprise you. Real people always surprise you. You think, oh, they're going to say, oh my God, we've got to fight our way out of here. And whatever they chose to do, I would write that into the story. Now, to the best of my knowledge, that technique has never been used in comics before or since. And if anyone's thinking of doing it, it is labor intensive. And if you've got some, make sure whoever you're basing it on, make sure they're interesting guys, not people who sat in their bedroom reading Spider-Man for the last 10 years. You're not going to get some very good stories out of them. But if you've got people who've lived and they've come up against adversity and so on, you're going to get a remarkable story. And it's a technique that's been used in British cinema, or British television anyway, and probably a little bit, I think, in American television. It's a bit different, but if you look at Larry David, Curb Your Enthusiasm, I think a lot of that is based on where people are actually almost acting their own personalities to a certain, he gives them a fair bit of leeway. He might be the controller, but I think he cuts them a certain amount of slack, I think. And I really wanted to do this in comics. And I still think as a style, we should really mine that on another occasion. It's a good thing to do. It keeps stories fresh. And so you're not just, I mean, okay, for a lot of the time when people read my stories or Garth Ennis's or Alan Moore's, you want to hear that writer's voice, but it's also interesting to see it filtered through other people's voices. And I like that as an approach. And that was very much part of Crisis, because my dream, which I mean, I wasn't the editor, so there was a limit to how much power and control I had. But what I wanted to do, I have the premise that real life people's stories are interesting and fascinating. So if you have someone who's been to prison, or if you have someone who's a revolutionary, or someone who is an ecological, well, we would say terrorist now, but back in the 80s, they were almost seen as kind of resistance fighters. You know, if they were fighting against giant corporations. And so what I wanted to do was to dramatize the stories of real life people. So I did one story with a writer about soldiers in Northern Ireland, and also what it's like to live in Northern Ireland in the middle of, you know, the secret war that was going on, and so on and so forth. So that was very much the direction that I wanted to go on personally with Crisis. But I think it's one of those things where you've got to be passionate about comics and politics to make it work. And I think somewhere down the line, I think this was more, and this sounds a bit cruel, but I think some of it was about imagery and posing. In other words, hey, we're really cool. Now, cool comics are a completely different genre. There's one that you may not know of in the States, that it's long gone, but it was certainly very cool, called Deadline. And that featured a character by Jamie Hewlett and the writer whose name I can't remember, called Tank Girl. And so that was the essence of cool. And so the thing is, if you don't quite know where you're going, right, then what you're going to do, and it's fucking fatal, and I still can't believe that people do this, you imitate other comics. So there was an element on Crisis that were trying to imitate Deadline, and that's fatal. You're either cool or you're not. But if you try to pretend to be cool, it's a bit like someone trying to be Mad Magazine when they're not that funny. You know what I mean? It would be embarrassing. In other words, Mad Magazine is great, but don't try and copy it. Just be yourself. And so I think on Crisis, it wasn't entirely itself. It didn't have, I mean, as an example to you, if you've got a kind of Alan Moore knockoff in one direction and this kind of real life heroes in another direction, they don't really reconcile with one another. And you've got to understand, what is it you're trying to say to kids? What is it you're trying to say to teenagers? And sometimes I think it's rocket science, because it looks so bleeding obvious to me. And I think, why doesn't anyone else get this? Because it's really obvious what you have to do. And, you know, you just think, and then just to be sure that you're not going off the rails yourself, you then talk to your age group and you say, how would you feel about this comic if I did this kind of story? And if they go, oh, that sounds boring, then back to the drawing board.
That's interesting, because when I was reading Crisis, it did kind of feel like towards the end, because it didn't last an inordinately long time either, but as it moved towards the end, it felt like it was kind of going through a bit of an identity crisis. And it's interesting to hear why, because as uneven as Crisis might have been, because I don't think it ever quite got on its feet as well as something, you know, like 2000 AD, but there are some great stories in there. And then there's some like it just never kind of, I guess, hit its niche. I was really hoping it would work out. I personally love Crisis, and for anybody watching this, They are pricey, but if you ever come across issues of Crisis or anything like that, I cannot recommend checking them out enough. Pat's stuff is amazing.
And on that
Sean,
subject, I should say that Third World War has actually been collected. In other words, I think currently there's 2 volumes of it in print, and there's a 3rd volume, which I think is due out probably early next year, I would guess. And that has artwork by John Hicklinton, who's some of your audience will know of as a great but real wild card artist. He did Zombie World with me for Dark Horse and so on. But there is some sensational artwork by Johnny in there. So yeah, that's, as you say, it's worth collecting. And of course, there's another thing about it that, that I remember having a real problem with. And it's kind of relevant if you're paying some huge price on eBay for it. The paper stock is wrong. The paper stock, from memory, the cover is the same paper weight as the interior. Now, you probably have the same thing in the States that we have in the UK. If you have some disposable catalogue that's shoved through your letterbox, it's all on this kind of cheap color paper, and it doesn't stand up like that. It just flops. So I always remember thinking, it's funny how one single thing can add to the demise of a comic. And I would say that one thing, if it was on better paper with better stock at the beginning, a glossy cover, whatever it is, that would have made a difference. And it just didn't have that quality about it. So if you're paying, I don't know, $30, $40 or something for an issue 1, I have no idea what the price will be, but it won't be cheap. It's a bit disappointing that it's got that floppy quality that makes it seem like it's, a Walmart catalog or something,
for me, when I opened it up, I instantly had the feeling that it was an underground comic from the U.S. Is the same kind of feeling I got from reading like my first like truly underground stuff, not like R. Crumb, who had money to put stuff out or anything. But when I first read stuff that was like, hey, I made this at Kinko's and we put this together, it did kind of have that feeling. But Crisis really is. I keep hoping that that it will get collected, and then it just like certain stuff from it will get collected. But even Troubled Souls, like that's Vertigo collected that.
It should have been collected, and it's possible on that one. It may be. I can't be sure because it was so long ago. But I think that Garth may have uniquely got the rights back to that story, and he may actually have that story. So it's within his remit rather than the current publisher. It might be possible that that particular story could be albumized and collected. And there was a sequel to it as well. And I'm trying to remember what that was called. I think it involved teenage boys burning down churches or something like that. There was a lot of anger there. And which is fantastic because, if you're reading comics at that point in your life as a student or whatever, you want to see how those things play out. And you've doubtless got the equivalent in the States, but in Britain, we have a tradition of these kind of films, notably by a director called Ken Loach. And Ken Loach made a lot of films about what could loosely be described as rebellious, angry young men. And I think it's a genre where, surely to God, there must be the American equivalent. And if there isn't, there should be. Because I'm sure there's lots of angry American teenagers as well as angry British teenagers. And I think their stories are important to tell. So yeah, I think Garth's stories tapped into that probably more so than My Third World War, which ultimately was about the politics of food. with the characters interacting on it. And I mean, that takes us into a complex area here where to reach the widest audience, you should always go for you put the characters first and the issues second. But there is a tradition in Britain of putting the issues first and the characters second. And you normally pay for it at the box office, but you're critically acclaimed and you'll get good art house reviews. So you know, I think what I try and do sometimes is walk the line between the two, which is always a risky place to go, but there you are. I mean, I did it to a certain degree in martial law, whereas, you know, it isn't just about satire, and it isn't just about what you might call hard crime drama. It's also on another level about political issues. And I was often drawing on, you know, the role of the United States in South and Central America, a lot of things that were going on there, and also in the Second World War, which probably isn't the most obvious fit, but it was something I think I in particular wanted to do. That, and it seemed to me that it was a way of doing it without being too polemical. I mean, it's a challenge, isn't it? Because the tradition, the Hollywood tradition, what do they say? It sounds too cheesy to almost repeat now. If you've got a message, use Western Union. You know, in other words, you know, stick to entertainment. And if you look at Marvel, well, they do it brilliantly. And if there's any kind of message there, it certainly missed me. You know, I've no idea what's up. I think there's very little subtext, and if you were to look at it, it might well be quite questionable. It might suggest, for example, American imperialism, and you know, which is particularly relevant as we speak. You know, with Afghanistan and so forth. But I thought to myself, if I want to get and I don't intend to use Western Union, I want to get a message across. Using a character like martial law is a good way of doing it. And I think for the most part, I think I got away with it because it's a way of reaching a large audience. In other words, saying something that they're not otherwise going to come across. Because if they read, let's say, okay, there's Fantagraphics. So there might well be a vehicle, but a Fantagraphics audience, I feel, is a little art house. It's quite sophisticated. They're probably not going to draw in your average Marvel reader. And what I was after with martial law was the Marvel readers. I mean, after all, we came out from Marvel, you know, and we're currently published by DC Comics, of all things, which is quite remarkable.
So let's get into martial law a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about how the initial development of martial law came about, and how you and O'Neill came together to work on the project?
Well, I think Marvel and Archie Goodwin in particular had always wanted to work with Kevin. And as I say, Kevin is very specialized in what he wants. So therefore, you know, I don't think there was a writer in the States that was that he was connecting with. And so, if you like, he brought me on board. I think that was very much, I came as part of the package, but I think, and so Kevin came up with the name martial law, and also the outrageous look of the character. And I originally wrote it as a straightforward cop drama. Really, I think this is what happens with a lot of writers, or it certainly happens with me. You write a synopsis because you don't even know if you're going to get the gig, and you know, so you're thinking, okay, well, I'm not going to spend, I would say, to do the full Monty on it would be, say, 6 weeks development. And you can't afford to do that. So you do this, I did this crime drama around him, which I think pressed all the relevant buttons, and Archie Goodwin said yes. And so then you actually have to look at it, and then you've got to really develop the character. And all that kind of nonsense I'm describing on Judge Dredd that was on public display, right? Now this was going to go on behind the scenes. In other words, I was now going to go through the process of development. And I kept looking at the character and thinking, yeah, he doesn't quite fit my story, because my story, rather like John Wagner on his early Judge Dredd, was a relatively straightforward cop. And so I had a relatively straightforward vigilante. And I thought, you know, he looks like a superhero. He looks a bit like a superhero. But I hate superheroes. How is it possible for me to write, you know, how can I deal with that? And then I thought, yeah, but what if he's a superhero hunter? What if he hunts superheroes? Then I can unleash all that bile that's within me, all that kind of dislike of, when I say I dislike superheroes, what I mean are the cheesy ones. I have a lot of admiration for, say, the early Spider-Man, you know, where with all that wonderful stuff of where he's having to wash his costume and he can't get the costume right, and all that kind of stuff. I think that's great fun. I'm talking about the cheesy guys. And so I rang Kevin up and I said, what about if he's a superhero hunter? And Kevin, I think, to say he ran with the ball would be an understatement. He galloped with the ball. He said, yeah, and then you could do this and this and this and this and this and this. I'm thinking, my God. And so suddenly this relatively constrained character enters this considerable universe where we've got this really complex world. And so a lot of that would have come from Kevin. And if you like, when I came to write it, it became, I think, probably darker and more personal on my side, because particularly on the first story, where I used a narrative system that I'd always wanted to use in comics, where you see things from the different points of view of the different characters. So, and I think it's something actually to be commended, and actually just thinking about it now, I'm thinking, oh my God, I should really have another shot at that. Because in a British comic, if you're only, as you saw, 3 pages or 6 pages long, to switch points of view is fatal. But in a 22-page comic, you can start off with Marshal Law's point of view, and you can stay with it for maybe, let's say, 10 pages. And then you have one of the bad guys, Suicider from Gangrene, and you have his point of view, and you show what's going on in his head, and so on and so forth. And so you get an interesting narrative drive there, and I think it got very powerful and deep, particularly with the character of the Sleep Man, this incredibly evil supervillain, and we got into his origins and so on, and I was able to do that by basing it on real people and all that kind of stuff. But to come back to Marvel and Archie, this is only a gut feeling rather than anything else. I think it may have put Archie a little on the spot, because after all, you know, he's doing Marvel Epic. These are great stories with a sort of fantasy element. And invariably, they don't really feature superheroes. But now along comes Marshal Law, who not only features a world of superheroes, many of them thinly disguised versions of Marvel characters, but they're taking the piss out of them. You know, they're portraying them as absolute monsters. And it's possible that he may have got some heat from above on that. I don't know. It's just a feeling I had. I think Archie was a fantastic guy and a fantastic editor. And I think part of being that kind of fantastic person is that if there was things going down, he would shield his creators from that, which is very commendable, but it is like taking some heat. And I can't be sure that that happened. And in fairness, in fairness to Marvel, for the most part, well, in fact, as far as we were aware, they took all that kind of piss taking with a great sense of humor, which is quite commendable, as far as we know. Again, I think there's all kinds of layers of hierarchies, and all that hierarchy at Marvel back at that time, of course, is long gone, and it's a different company now, and all the rest of it. But I have a feeling it must have pissed some people off. In fact, I think it did. I think a lot of I'm trying to recall now. I mean, at the time we were rather gleeful about it. Oh, it's a bit like juvenile delinquents, smashing a place up or something. I think we were a bit gleeful, but I think we were aware that conventional superhero artists or writers were a little dismayed by the character, and that even applied in Britain. So when we did our Batman piss take on martial law, I always remember Simon Bisley, and I think he represented many artists both here and probably in the States as well, who kind of regard Batman as an icon, which he is, and a sacred icon too. In other words, not to be messed with. And so he felt that what we did on Batman was quote unquote rather mean-spirited. And yeah, I think it was. I mean, I think both Kevin and I are mean-spirited, particularly when superheroes are concerned, and it would be pointless to pretend otherwise, I think. So yeah, but we had a lot of fun with it, and as I say, Archie was great on it, and I think all of us in the business miss him to this day.
That's awesome that you had such a great editor on the series. I was curious how much pushback and how much change there had to be, because I know Epic was fairly easy to work with for some people, and for other people it was kind of a logistic nightmare. And it kind of parallels a lot of like what was going on with Crisis, where the larger publisher is trying to do a smaller imprint where you guys are giving creator rights to the actual creators. Was that one of the reasons that you chose to work with Epic, was retaining your rights? I was curious what made what inspired the move across the pond.
Absolutely. Yeah, the lack of rights in Britain is particularly awful. I mean, I know the situation in from what I can gather with Marvel and DC and so forth is by no means perfect, but it's still a quantum leap compared to Britain. And it's because even if you do have a kind of onerous work for hire system, if it's successful, if your book's successful, it will pay well. In Britain, the money involved is not good. And I mean, Kevin really was kind of, that's why he was working for the States. That's why he had to work for the States. And owning your own book does make a difference. It has paid off for us. I mean, we still get, royalties and merchandising and so on martial law that we certainly would not have got if Kevin was drawing a regular Marvel or DC book. Although, as you doubtless know, the possibility of that, certainly back then, and might be different today, but of course he's retired, but the possibility of that was very remote. You probably know the wonderful story about the US Comic Code Authority, who complained about some short story he'd done for DC with Alan Moore. And so that I think DC asked the Comic Code Authority, well, look, what is it that Kevin can do to make it right? And they said nothing. It's his basic way he looks at things that's not for them, you know. So I think I couldn't imagine a situation where Kevin would have been comfortable working on a regular Marvel or DC book. Although ironically, I mean, as I say, he's retired, but I'm quite sure if he was to say to Marvel or DC tomorrow, hey, I'm up for, let's just say something hypothetical. I'm up for drawing Incredible Hulk, let's say. I think they'd be biting his hand off because he is such a name now and everything. But unfortunately, too much water's flown under the bridge, and a lot of it's quite polluted water. And therefore, you know, the days when that could have happened are long gone. But isn't it a pity that you have to go through this arc and through some rough times on occasion before you become recognized as the supreme talent that Kevin is? I mean, he really is in a you know, in a class of his own, and it's a pity that it has to be such a long journey, and it's kind of acknowledged at a stage where he's actually retired and said, that's it, journey's over.
It is extremely sad, for me at least personally, that he's risen to prominence here in the States more and more and more as time goes on. Originally, you know, it was his connections with other people that I think brought a lot of people to his work. But everything that he has ever done, he throws his all behind, and it's evident from every page. And that's another thing that I can say about your work as well. I just have very rarely come across any of your stuff where I was like, oh yeah, he just wanted to make a paycheck here. You were always trying to do something. There was a higher level that you were operating on. And when you guys came together on martial law, it's just, especially considering how long and how many different permutations that character and title, you know, which I use kind of loosely, but I guess that universe went through, was extremely interesting to watch. Can you talk a little bit about how and why the universe of martial law, you guys went through a lot of different publishers, kind of took it where you wanted to over the years, I'm assuming where the deals were best. And I was curious how much that affected the stories and the tone of the stories, you know, because you were talking about the comedy, or if that was more of just a conscious thing that you guys were like, this story came out comedic and we're going to sell it this way.
Yeah, I think it was a very ragged journey. I think, yeah, I think the difficulty is that if you think of that first series, it was, what was it, 6 issues? I think it was 6 issues. It wasn't 12, it was 6. So six months. Now I think there's a lot of superhero artists who could take that 6 months in their stride and they'll be on to the next one and the next one. But for Kevin, there was a lot of pressure to get the next one out, but he is a slow artist. He's not slow as in the case of, say, Brian Bolland or Glenn Fabry. He's slow in a different way. I think it's a meticulous detail, and I think he gets very drawn into the world. And of course, the other thing we should add here is that Kevin is also doing something else that I think is unique to martial law now. I don't think it applies to any of his other stories, either by with me or with Alan Moore. He's adding this graffiti the whole time. So he's adding a kind of satirical commentary, and that's utterly unique. It's like a soundtrack on a comic. And I know that very occasionally other artists have imitated it, but it's not, and I'm thinking of one case, the late Martin Emond, who had elements of it in Accident Man, and he did it very well. But for the most part, it's a unique thing that Kevin did. And so it's like he's almost commenting on the story with his graffiti, much of which is, I don't know how to describe it. It's surreal, and for any other artist, it would be inappropriate. But it's so hardwired into the artwork that it makes it valid for Kevin. And then he's also doing other things where he's creating fantasy scenes. The one that springs to mind is, and yet maintaining a level of realism, because, you know, if people think the story is silly, then you've lost your audience. So he's creating all this reality, this grim reality. And yet, from memory, there's a scene where Police Commissioner McGland, I think, is sitting in a huge office on a huge desk. And I think there's sharks in the water running around. He's got a moat or something, which, you know, there's no way even I as a writer could make sense of why on earth he's got this. He's completely out to lunch, but it works because, and of course the reason it works is because Kevin believes it. So therefore he makes the audience believe it. And I think that's an area that I would love to have seen more of. And so anyway, having done that, we then there was pressure for Kevin to do more. And so from memory, I think we did Takes Manhattan, which was a shorter story, which meant that Kevin could get it out faster. And I believe it was colored by an excellent colorist, because otherwise Kevin would have freaked out if it had been badly colored. And so that gave him a kind of breathing space. And I think then we did Kingdom of the Blind, the kind of Batman one. And by then we were finding, I think both Kevin and I have managed to get used to, what shall we say, working for big corporations, producing work and so on. But I think both of us are a slightly uneasy fit. And I think that was starting to happen in the case of Marvel. It wasn't giving Kevin and myself either the economic return that we wanted. That makes us sound awfully greedy, but I think we're really talking about just subsistence living. In other words, and so therefore we were made an offer, if you like, we couldn't refuse, which was to. There was a British comic called Toxic, and Marshal Law would headline this comic, and this comic Toxic would also produce Kingdom of the Blind as a one-shot, as a 48-page one-shot. And so that was what we set out to do. And of course, one of the things you soon discover as you move around from one publisher to the next is you go out of the frying pan into the fire, and then into another fire, and so on. I think we probably at that point in our lives were sort of convinced that there was some Shangri-La, some ideal publisher somewhere on the horizon who would make all our problems go away, mainly financial. And of course, it's never the case. And so Toxic came out, and you're right, the tone of the first story that followed there was very much kind of reflecting a British interest. Kevin felt that there was, and this is long before zombie stories were that popular, but he felt let's do a zombie story, and I think both of us would say in retrospect that there were aspects of that story that didn't entirely sit comfortably with the general thrust of martial law. We made it work. I think that's how I would describe it, but I don't think it was a natural fit. And I think it was partly dictated to by the British weekly comic that we were in, Toxic, and we thought, well, if we do it this way, it will appeal. But I don't think it was a natural fit. That's probably the best way to put it. And I think we kind of rescued it. And then, of course, in the meantime, Toxic goes bust. You know, in other words, it did have an audience, but not big enough. And the demands of full color comic. I mean, I just say this as a digression here, and it still applies today in Britain. We don't fully understand enough of these things. It's one, you know, on Marvel, where for the most part, I don't know if you still have, but you know, everyone fully understands, you know, regular comics and regular color comics, and then you've got more deluxe painted ones, and there's a lot of experience that's gone into this. In other words, you've got editors and publishers who've been doing this for maybe a couple of decades. But if you jump around as we did in Britain, none of us had done this stuff before, because we come from this very humble black and white comics for the most part. And suddenly we've entered the world of not just color comics, but fully painted comics. And as you well know, I'm sure, fully painted comics gets you into all kinds of potential trouble, because you can have someone who can't actually draw, but is a great painter. So you got paint disguising all kinds of things. And what's worse, I think, is you can alienate the reader, because a hardcore fan will say, oh, I love the painting on this. And then say a 17-year-old kid says, yeah, but I don't know what's going on. It's too dark. I can't work. What's happening? It's all very impressionistic. And it takes a genius like Bill Sienkiewicz to make that work. And I mean, you know, I'm a huge fan of Bill's work, but it is demanding, but you know at the same time that you are dealing with a master craftsman. But when you've got Bill Sienkiewicz wannabes, and some of them are never going to make it, this is very confusing. And some of that leaked into Toxic. So, I mean, God knows what British readers thought. You know, they've gone from Crisis, which is good in places, but it's trying to be like Deadline, and Deadline is cool, but there's only that many cool readers in the world, in Britain, shall we say. And now you've got Toxic with all this full color, because it's trying to ride on the back of Simon Bisley's seminal Horn God, Slain the Horn God, which is, you know, here for the first time, you've got Frank Frazetta in comics. I mean, it's genius, absolute genius. But once you try repeating it over and over, no, it's not going to happen. So suddenly, all of us are involved in things that are, I don't think any of us have ever, I mean, I'll certainly put my hand up to it, it's well above our pay grade. We don't know what the hell we're doing some of the time, you know, and neither do the artists. So there's a lot of mayhem there, a lot of chaos. And anyway, so Toxic went, and then we thought, right, let's go to Dark Horse. It will be safe in Dark Horse, you know. I think deep down, I think we're looking for some father figure, you know, some paternalism, someone who's gonna, I mean, that's maybe how it's coming over to me right now. And I think it wasn't that different at the time. Hey, Mike Richardson will make everything all right. And Mike, of course, is keen to have martial law, because he wants this, you know, this wonderful portfolio that Dark Horse certainly had at the time, with so many, you know, so many prestigious titles, and martial law would be another notch on his belt. And so let me see. But again, we weren't getting the kind of financial rewards that we wanted. And Kevin was once again very slow. I should say in all of this that nobody, to my recollection, ever interfered with the stories, which were getting more and more outrageous. I mean, the one we did for Dark Horse, I'm trying to remember its title. It's gone out of my mind at the moment, but it featured the the Junior League of Superheroes or something. These kind of piss takes on the DC characters. And my God, that was a labor of love for Kevin. You know, all these ridiculous superheroes of the past, these junior, something like the Junior League or something. And I think it was after we did that particular book that DC Comics struck us off their mailing list. They'd been sending us these wonderful books, you know, these wonderful, you know, vintage collections and so on. And I think they quite rightly thought, why are we feeding, you know, these quality books to these two people who are really taking the piss out of us? So, yeah. So coming back to Dark Horse, it wasn't giving us the return we wanted. And I think either at that stage or maybe it was subsequently, I think then after the Dark Horse thing, we were once more kind of footloose and fancy free. And somewhere down the line, we did a crossover for Marvel with Pinhead. And I think that worked quite well. I'm not sure Kevin was entirely happy with the color on that, but he may have been. It's hard to recall now. But certainly, I think Kevin enjoyed the Pinhead thing, and I found an angle on it that worked for me. So I think it was a good enough fit. And then, having gone round all these people, we were starting to run out. Where else can we go? I think it's that thing of thinking, oh, things will be better in the next field. You know, we just cross over, things will be better. And of course, I think we're both much older and wiser now. We know they're not. So by now we were running out of options, and I think then we did the Savage Dragons story. And I think even the fact that that's in black and white is almost a sign of how our world is closing in on us. The telephone isn't ringing for us anymore. You know what I mean? Well, who else is there to ring? We didn't think, we may have approached DC at that point, but I think we would have been a little wary because I think if we had signed up with DC, I think they would have been a little controlling. And also bear in mind, DC, you've got Vertigo, which represents a kind of what you might call a kind of goth art house student quality, which isn't entirely a great fit for martial law. Black Label maybe today because it's a little more all-embracing, but Vertigo had definitely this kind of goth thing that was very much a reflection of Karen and so on. And we found more and more, and this applies to British publishers as well. Everyone's much more coy these days. No one will come. In the past, it's something this is me showing my age now. In the past, people in comics would be a bit more forthright, and they'd actually say, I fucking hate your book, or whatever it is. But these days, everyone's much more coy, and they play their cards really close. But I'm a strong observer of human anatomy, and I watch people's faces on things. So I kind of know when they, and you know, I could always see, and I think Kevin, if he was joining in this conversation, would agree. We got the distinct impression that Karen, for all her politeness, was not a big fan of martial law, you know, but she never really came out with it. So we were kind of reluctant for martial law to go there. And so what you can see is we'd run out of road. And I think it was roughly around this point that, if you like, Alan Moore came along with his League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And the rest is history, as they say. And that was the end of martial law. I mean, it wasn't so much that, if you like, Kevin jumped ship. There was nowhere left for us to go. We had run out of road. And you could probably say you know, looking back on it, there was probably something we should have done differently. You know, we should have done something that perhaps could have led to martial law being more widely known, more successful. Maybe we should have stayed with Marvel. Maybe we should have stayed with Dark Horse. But I remember things got a little intense with Dark Horse because Kevin wasn't a fast artist, and I think he was getting a lot of pressure from them. And I mean, you look at Kevin's work. I mean, it's like saying to a fine artist, "Can you hurry up and finish the Sistine Chapel?" No, it'll be ready when it's ready. But that's always a problem for artists who have crossed the line between commercial art and fine art. And in a way, I think Kevin's work does sort of enter the world of fine art and an art house, if you like, as well as being very, very commercial. And, you know, the only way you find these things out is by trial and error, and usually by an editor yelling at you.
Can you talk a little bit about the development of martial law? Because at the center of martial law, there's two distinct possibilities. I remember when I heard someone pitch me the idea of martial law, and there was two distinct ideas that I had in my head. One that was that was the Watchmen route of going extremely gritty, extremely realistic. You've worked with Alan, you know how his mind used to work with deconstruction and just viewing a universe. And the other for me was just abstract parody, which pays little to no, while it pays homage, it pays little love to the source material in a lot of cases. And it's interesting to hear you bring up Mad, because Mad is one of the few parodies that I do feel like pays a lot of love to its subject material. And martial law is it's not a parody book in any sense, I don't think.
No, it's not.
But you know, as you said, it's very much in the British tradition of taking the piss out of things. And I'm curious what the kind of evolution, how martial law was born.
Okay, well, you know, I've sort of explained that whole superhero hunter thing, but moving on from that point, with surprisingly, I mean, Kevin actually likes superheroes, at least I think he likes them, but he also loves taking the piss out of them. So in fact, often, if you were to point to a particularly cruel joke or whatever in martial law, or a very satirical piece, the chances are that may well have come from Kevin rather than from me. In other words, he's sort of biting invective is very, very strong. But there's an underlying theme that takes us away from parody and also well away from Watchmen as well. And that element in the story, because there's so many layers on it, I wouldn't say that it's confusing the message, but you've got layer upon layer upon layer. But the underlying thread is not actually to do with superheroes at all. And if I talk to my psychiatrist, if you like, about it, the underlying thing about is, what is a hero? And that's a much deeper subject than Marvel superheroes, because we all look for heroes. We all try to be heroes. Our various life stories, in many ways, all represent a hero's journey. In other words, and as you know, there are various archetypes along the way. And what interested me was not, here's an opportunity for me to take the piss out of American superheroes because I don't like them very much. That wasn't really it for me. What was underlying it all was, what is a hero? And this is why martial law's mantra is, I'm a hero hunter. I hunt heroes. haven't found any yet. And it's because I think we have very debased ideas of what heroes are, based usually on technology. So we might say, you know, the American technology, for example, is so advanced now. And that reflects, if you like, American superheroes, who their superpowers are equally advanced. And of course, as you'll doubtless know, if you look at any of the conflicts like Iraq and so on, they often use superhero imagery on their aircraft or helicopters or tanks or whatever it is. So there's a recognition, but of course, generally speaking, to be a hero, you might be dealing with something quite mundane. Your struggle may seem very unglamorous. And I really wanted to pursue that. Hence this series, Charlie's War, where, you know, you've got this guy and it's incredibly popular in Britain. And I think if there had been an American equivalent of it, it would have been equally popular in the States. I don't think it's a uniquely British thing. But he's a kid in the trenches. So for 4 or 5 years, or whatever it was, I think the story ran for maybe 6 or 7. He's just an ordinary kid, and he has to do heroic things, but that heroic thing might involve running down a trench and then climbing over into no man's land, and then jumping down into another trench on the other side, and that for him is a super heroic task. So I really wanted to cover the definition and the heroism. You know, what does it actually take to be a hero? And you could say, and I think it would be true, and perhaps it's true for so many stories. I mean, all writers perhaps face this problem. It feels like a work in progress. I don't think I've quite had the last thing to say on it. A digression here. I've actually brought Slain to an end, my Celtic hero, and I like to think that I've more or less had the last word on him. But normally you think, oh God, there's another book in this. And I think that's endlessly true for martial law, isn't it? I mean, my God, there's so many possibilities there. So it's, what is a hero? That was the driving theme of martial law. And then there was a second element to it that I've always sort of been in touch with, but I've never, there were so many other things going on in martial law. It was almost like we never got around to it. And I think that's why, in a way, the zombie story in Toxic was a bit of a digression, because, yeah, it's another colorful area, but we weren't really getting to the core of the hero and also the villain. Now, the villains in martial law are unequivocally people who pretend to be heroes, but actually aren't heroes. Now, that might seem like I'm having a go at I don't know, Superman, Batman, and so on, and there are elements of that. But actually, it's more to do with, if you like, my social background. In other words, all my stories have this sense of challenging authority. So what it means, for example, is that the people I would have encountered as a kid, as a teenager and beyond, establishment figures, authority figures. It's a very simple process to turn them into superheroes. And so that's actually, rather than it being about, it might seem like it's about Superman or whatever, but I mean, you can see elements of it in Public Spirit, for example, where he differs from Superman in so much as he's a kind of quasi-religious figure, kind of influenced by Ronald Reagan. And that would probably have taken me back to my childhood, where there would have been authority figures who are very Catholic and very religious and saying this is the way it has to be. And of course, also, although I was sort of more vaguely aware of it than anything else, you see it comes through with things like, for example, the Jesus League of America. Now, that's that's both Kevin O'Neill and myself, both Irish Catholic boys, reflecting that element. But it's not entirely obscure, and anyone who's in the States who has a Catholic background might recognize this. You have in the States the Knights of Columba, which is a kind of religious order of religious organization of lay people who are usually successful businessmen. They get dressed up, that kind of stuff, but they're authority figures, right? And if you look at their costumes, if you Google them, they're not a million miles away from superheroes. They wear colorful plumes and all the rest of it. Now, we have the equivalent of that in Britain called the Knights of St. Columba. And they all sort of influence each other and so on. But they also wear very colorful, or not as colorful as the American ones, but fairly colorful. And I had, what should we say, some negative encounters with them as a kid. So how far I was aware of it, I don't know, but I'm certainly aware of it now. There's a bit of payback there, you know what I mean? In other words, you know, the golden rule for all creators, writers and artists is you write what you know about. And so maybe alongside, you know, maybe I think it's about superheroes on one level, but actually it's about these toffee-nosed, stuck-up guys who are telling me, now this is what you've got to do, son, and this is who you've got to be, and all that kind of stuff. And in some ways it was easier to just make them superheroes. But even there, we'd still have to draw on things. So for example, to take the public spirit, I would have used Ronald Reagan's speeches. I remember I had a collection of the damn things. If you look closely at that first story, you'll see, I think there's some, I think there's a line where he says, I'm a bit afraid, I can't do a Ronald Reagan voice, I'm sorry about that, I wish I could. I'm a bit afraid to say what I'm going to say, but I'm more afraid not to. Will you join me in a moment of silent prayer? You know, I think there's something like that the public spirit says. That's Ronald Reagan. That comes from Ronald Reagan. And then there's another bit which is more easily to identify, which is the public spirit has got the San Simeon, which is from Randolph Hearst. So we comb through Randolph Hearst, and there's I think there's one scene where he has an entire fireplace ripped out because it's not, you know, the smoke's not going up the chimney properly. And you'll see the public spirit is being equally petulant there. So you can see what's happening. I mean, if you look at the origins of Superman, he's actually a very honorable guy created by two people who want to get back on, was it his dad or something was killed by some scumbag criminal. And I mean, that's all, I can really relate to that. So in some ways, the public spirit, he may look like he has elements in common with Superman, but really what we're drawing on is any figure of authority. And I don't know how aware I was of the Knights at the time. But if you look at my other stories, you'll see they're full of stories trashing Knights. I mean, I haven't stopped to this day. So obviously they left a profound impression on me. And I think that's a useful thing to do. I mean, it's self-evident, but it bears repeating that, you know, if you're going to write about villains, write about people who've crossed your path and pissed you off. And it's a valuable catharsis. And it also helps you get in touch with why you don't like them. And you know, what is it about them that stifled something within you or challenged something within you? And I think that's why the villains in martial law, they all resonate one way or another. And you know, I think thinking back on it, and it's a good thing, but there's so much creativity between Kevin and I. I wouldn't say we're competing for space, because we're not. A good idea is a good idea. So if Kevin comes up with something, in it goes. But you can see that in an ideal world, if we had started the character maybe 10 years earlier, there would be so many more martial law books, and we probably get opportunities to explore all the different layers of this character who's asking that question, what is a hero? Now, that said, it's just reminded me, one of the things that happens in a movie and is you're on thin ice if you do this in the comic, as Marvel creators know, where they regularly reinvent their characters rather than develop them. So I had in the Savage Dragon one story, this bit where Marshal Law says, I finally found a hero. I think it's the Savage Dragon from memory. It's a long while ago now. Or maybe he says, I found one and it was myself, or something like that, where he finally finds a hero. And as I say, I'd have to have it in front of me to recall exactly. But what I remember was, I was doing a signing for Martial Law in Portugal, in Lisbon. And it got a very good turnout there because there was a Portuguese edition of Martial Law, which also sold in Brazil. And there was a long line of people queuing up, and there was one teenager queuing up. And when it came to his turn, he said, I love martial law, but you are a bastard for that ending, and walked off. And I thought to myself, yeah, I can understand that, because in movies, it's a prerequisite that the character has to develop. The first thing a film script editor will tell you is, what has changed? How has the character evolved? What has he learned from things? And so from a movie point of view, the fact that Martial Law has finally discovered a hero, whether it was himself or the Savage Dragon, doesn't matter, but he's evolved, right? From a comic point of view, that's a no-no, because what audiences want, and I'm sure this must be a biggest problem on Spider-Man, is they want stasis. They don't want to discover that Spider-Man has gone through some kind of transgender change, or he's become a capitalist, or he's become a hippie, or I would imagine what they want is more and more of the original same. And that's true for British comics as well. We love stasis. We want things to remain the same. And that's why I'm as guilty of this as anybody. So for example, in Judge Dredd, you will hear me endlessly rave about John Wagner's original Judge Dredd. And that sometimes gets me into trouble with Judge Dredd fans who say, yeah, but what about the recent Judge Dredds by new writers? You know, in other words, where they're doing new things with Judge Dredd. But you see, I'm like that kid in Portugal. You know, I just want the same. I want more and more of the same. I don't want change. Isn't it funny how we want that? And yet in novels or movies, we look for change. We want character development, but we don't want it in comics. We want the same.
It is very interesting. It's one of the dichotomies that I think has actually played a large part in retarding the evolution of especially the superhero genre. And guys like Alan Moore and Garth Ennis get a lot of flack here in the US because they make
Slack and slack. They get both, yeah. Exactly, yeah.
Because they hammer on superhero comics and they talk about how our fixation with them and the idea of a superhero is so counterintuitive to the evolution and the possibilities that are capable with the comic book medium. And that's one of the things that I always found extraordinarily interesting about martial law, is that it never actually fell into that territory of, despite everybody being in costumes, despite everyone running around in a superhero world, he's not lying when he says he hasn't found a hero. It's not just the way he feels. It's the truth. There are no heroes in that universe. And it was all about characters. It's been very interesting to learn about how you approach characters and your thought process when it comes to people, because that seems to have played a very large part in the general germination and growth of martial law as a series.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm thinking, I think particularly with the Sleep Man, I made him a very disturbed character. He would have been based offhand on maybe around, actually on about 3 different people. And I think that's, I mean, that's always a little risky because they've got but they really do meld together and you wouldn't really see the join when I think back on it. So I used the speech pattern of one person. Oh, and actually I should probably tell you this. There was this, you very occasionally get a really maniacal fan, and probably I've only had one over the years, which probably doesn't mean I haven't got such a big fan following as others, but I got this one particular guy and he would send me very long critical tomes about why what I was doing was wrong, but he was still reading it and so on. And I thought his speech pattern was remarkable. So I dissected it and I used his speech pattern for the Sleep Man, because I thought, well, I've got to sit there and read this bloody thing. Or I don't have to, I could just chuck it in the bin. But I thought, well, it's actually interesting because I do like, you know, as I was saying earlier, it's often customary for people to enjoy a writer's work because it's one unified voice. I don't actually like that. I prefer disparity. So I actually go out of my way. I mean, I always have a notebook in my pocket and I'm writing down what people say. So, and I will incorporate that into characters. So that's where one element came from. And then there was a very troubled teenager who told me aspects of his life story. And with his okay, I incorporated those into the character. And I've probably done that elsewhere. Sometimes it wasn't always possible. So, I mean, one of the advantages actually of doing Third World War in Crisis was it enabled me to research South and Central America. And that's where some of the ideas in martial law come from. For example, Suicida, I think, was the name of some kind of Central American gangster around about the time of the Contras. And, you know, you're reading this as you know, when you're researching politics of food in South America and everything, you suddenly come across this name and you think, my God, what a great name, Suicida. I have to use that. And so there were things like that I tended to do, and probably all writers do this. You bring ideas from one story into another because it eases the burden of research, which otherwise can be, you know, if you've got to, I mean, for example, there's a whole South American element to martial law, which we actually turned into a novel, text novel, Kevin and I think it's called The Day of the Dead. It'll be on a hideous price on eBay, and DC Comics will never reprint it, but there you go. So yeah, it was dealing with all the masks, you know, the Mexican masks on the Day of the Dead. And we figured that's how martial law got this strange and hideous look to him. But you kind of do that by researching another story, because if you sat down and from cold and said, okay, I'm going to research South and Central American culture, that's a big ask to do that. And it can be quite uneconomic. And so you know, you need all that background information as best you can, and then draw on it, you know, when you come to writing. So yeah, things like Suicida definitely came from that. I think there were other elements as well. Oh yeah, for example, in The Persecutor, in Martial Law Takes Manhattan, there's some pretty grotesque stories there about CIA setting up the School of the Americas, where they were teaching Central American and South American police forces to use torture. And this was created at the School of the Americas, I think. And so the Persecutor becomes that kind of villain. Now, that kind of villain is relatively easy to write because he's just utterly evil. He's doing horrible, horrible things, and there's no justification for them, and so on. So in a way, that's a relatively easy character to create. You're not having to draw on one of these knights I knew as a kid, for example. And I don't know, I think the Persecutor was a good character, but I wouldn't say he perhaps had the depth of the Sleep Man, but arguably that's because the Sleep Man has an entire story, a whole chapter devoted to him. But at the same time, there's so much comedy that overtakes the thing. I mean, I think Kevin had some wonderfully awful ideas about how I think the Persecutor gets captured by tramps, and there's this scene where he's being turned on a spit or something. I mean, I can't remember how that came about, but I'm pretty certain that was Kevin's idea. As I say, the harshest ideas in martial law, often they come from Kevin, yeah.
That may be why, and he seems to love the medium as much as you do, so that's probably one of the big reasons it never strayed into that hateful territory. It always felt so. It was an outsider book, but it always felt like it was not poking fun, but rather looking in like some sort of funhouse mirror reflection of everything else. Was what I appreciated most about it.
I think that probably is true. That there are weights and counterweights. I mean, I don't think anyone. My God, I think it would be an awesome task to do, because they're from two entirely separate people at different times. But yeah, well, Watchmen perhaps has much more gravitas, doesn't it? I think, and I think I think it's no coincidence that when I watched Watchmen, I think I've watched it 2 or 3 times now, the bit I always love is one of the opening credits scenes where this guy's being taken away in a van by men in white coats. Well, of course, you can see why I would love it, because it's so pure martial law. But then some of the story that follows is much more somber and has a different tone to it, which is its unique hallmark, but it's very different to martial law. And I mean, I always thought myself that that Watchmen made, I don't know, it opened up this whole new element with superheroes where you could look at them in a sophisticated way. And I suppose how I would challenge it more was, if they're heroes, that's fine, but what is a hero? And these guys, I mean, guys like the Persecutor, he's not a hero. He's a evil individual. And it's always a little bit of, I don't know if Kevin would ever have gone along with it. He probably would have done, I suppose. The Zone, of course, was obviously influenced by Vietnam, but when you get to the Iraq War with Abu Ghraib and all that kind of stuff, I wonder whether Kevin would have countenanced that. He probably would have done, I think. Because as I say, it is very much artist-led. I mean, if Kevin doesn't feel like doing it, he's not going to do it. You know what I mean? So you've got to kind of tempt him into it. I think one of the things we would have done, this gives you an idea of the kind of direction. We applied this to a martial law text novel we did together. think it was called, Cape Fear, but I believe so, yeah. This applied to a British political scandal, which I won't go into because your audience will be going, what the fuck is all that about? So I'll mention an American one that we considered. And I think if we'd done it, say 15 years ago, or certainly 20 years ago, it would have been fine. It's too late now. In other words, I think it's all become a bit passé, but it would have been one of the things that we, and you've seen me example this in some directions already, but what we would do is take a famous political scandal. So we took a British scandal, which was known as the Profumo scandal, and it was about a call girl, Christine Keeler, who was sleeping with the Minister of Defence. And this was a huge scandal in Britain in the 1960s, and it completely, well, it almost changed British society. So we thought, and I can remember us thinking about this for a while, why don't we look for an American scandal and make everyone into superheroes? And I think that explains how it isn't just about taking the piss out of recognized comic book characters. And the ones that we had in mind was the Kennedys. And you think about it, you have Marilyn Monroe, it's got to be the ultimate superheroine. And I think, I can't imagine what Kevin's version of Marilyn Monroe would have been. But she's having an affair with Robert Kennedy. She dies under mysterious circumstances. You've got the making of is it Elmore Leonard kind of murder mystery there already, you know what I mean? And of course, and then you've got the president, who could well be another public spirit, you know, John F. Kennedy, and he gets assassinated, and all that kind of thing. And of course, there are many other elements to the whole. You've got Aristotle Onassis. I can't imagine what Kevin would do with some kind of grotesque, because Kevin, actually, I must mention something else in a moment that is relevant on this, but Kevin would undoubtedly have discovered all kinds of appalling things about Aristotle Onassis that I'm not going to repeat. You know what I mean? And they would all go into this kind of character. So you can see the kind of world that would evolve. And I do remember we talked about the Kennedys for a while, but of course, everything is now so much in the public domain. It would seem a little, it's like its time has gone. But one of the books, and I should have mentioned this before, but it's just come back to me, and it is available, so people can actually get it. I think the last time I looked, I think it was on Amazon. So you wouldn't have to go on eBay for this. Can't remember the name of the author, but I remember the title very, very well. Starlust. Now, Kevin finds these amazing books, and this book, Starlust, is the it describes the behavior of fans and how they behave. The two that stand out in my mind are Barry Manilow and David Bowie. And if anyone who looks up Starlust, you're going to think, my God. And you'll see where that's where a lot of the first martial law adventure actually comes from looking at Starlust, because these fans, they weren't just obsessed with Barry Manilow. They were saying things like, for example, 2,000 years ago, a very special person died. And now I think he's returned in the form of Barry Manilow, in the form of Barry, meaning, you know, he's the next Jesus Christ. Well, can you imagine the reaction of Kevin and I to this kind of stuff? We were looking at this with considerable glee. You know what I mean? Thinking this stuff is fantastic for, and this gives some of the stories that particular nuance. And as I say, I have to say, I mean, I'm quite good at research myself, but I think Kevin, for some reason, has got the edge over me, which I'm kind of jealous of him. He comes across these obscure accounts and says, do you know about this? And of course, so obviously I bought the book Starlust and used some great sections from it. But for instance, on Kingdom of the Blind, this is one where I don't know how we did it exactly, but he told me a story, which I think is now very well known, but I didn't know about it at the time, that when Batman and Robin, the TV series, was coming out, that the Catholic League of, I think it's League rather than Legion, may have been Legion, Catholic League of Decency had objected to Robin because his costume was too tight fitting, so his balls were showing. So in order for him not to look, well, it's obviously offending. You can imagine two Catholic guys like Kevin and myself, we're laughing our heads off over this. And so he was given pills to reduce his manhood. And this is on record. You know, if you look it up, it's a well-known story now. But Kevin, how Kevin comes across this stuff, I don't know. So that's certainly something I should mention. You know, if you're talking about, you know, where does all the material come from? From not least because Kevin is an incredible researcher, and he comes across all kinds of stuff that I think are just fantastic. Starlust is anyone who, these people were similarly obsessed with David Bowie as well. Probably needs, in some ways it was better. I mean, we were obviously also looking at, and I remember I was quite keen on this, but I don't think there were as many gems there. Hollywood Babylon was great as well. You know, you got some wonderful stuff there. But I think we really need a new Starlust or a new Hollywood Babylon to really charge us up for a new generation. Maybe somebody else is going to do not another Marshal Law, but a character that presses a similar button. Yeah, it would be good.
So, you know, I know that Kevin is retired. I also know that he's kind of been tempted out. Moore kind of has managed to tempt him out a little bit with a little bit of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen work and that kind of stuff over, you know, even though he's not working in the industry, you know, for hire, I guess would be the best term. Do you guys ever plan on doing anything else with martial law? The last thing that I remember was maybe like 15 years ago when you guys were doing the illustrated novellas.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's that sort of Sean Connery line, isn't it? Never say never again. I mean, in theory, it's never say never again. And so, for example, on 2000 AD's 40th birthday, which I think was about 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. And so 2000 AD said to me, would Kevin and myself like to do a final Nemesis story? And we had killed off Nemesis, we killed off Torquemada, that's the villain in the story. And I thought that would be absolutely impossible. And I said to them, no, there's no way Kevin would be interested. And they said, well, you know, if you're sure. And I said, well, look, let me just check with Kevin just to be absolutely sure, because it's his decision as well as mine. And to my astonishment, Kevin said, yeah, I'd love to do a 40th birthday story. And I was completely gobsmacked because I really thought, that's it. He's finished with Nemesis. He'd never be interested in another one. So we did a final story, which was as irreverent and as appalling as ever. And my recollection on that is a little bit of a digression, was once again, we hit this problem that it's a 6-page story and we both had masses of ideas and only this tiny space to fit them in. And I don't know. I mean, I think probably everyone recognizes that that's our hallmark, that we have these somewhat congested stories overloaded with ideas. So to return to martial law, you know, I think if someone came along and said, would you and Kevin like to do a one-off martial law story for such and such and such? You know, I think if it was the right occasion, in theory, Kevin would say no, but in practice, if it was the, if it was the right time of year, if it was in the right mood, he might say yes. It's still in development. This is an entirely separate thing. But I think I can say this much. There's a computer game which doesn't major on martial law, but features him as one of the characters. It's one of those. I'm going to really show. I'm not even going to attempt to show my ignorance and say what kind of game it is, because people go, "Ah, yeah, you mean that, Pat? Yeah, I don't even know what I mean. All I know is that it's a significant character in a kind of multiverse, and probably all your computer game fans will be going, "Oh, yeah, I think I know what sort of thing you mean." That's in development, and of course, as with all things in development, it means it may never see the light of day. I mean, if it was a movie, I wouldn't even be mentioning it, because I think, yeah, that's never going to happen. But this does look like it will eventually, and just like movies, we're probably talking about I don't know, 18 months, maybe 2 years from now before it. But thus far, we've been very pleased with the way we've been treated on that, and what they're doing with the thing and how they're developing it. So that's quite a pleasant surprise, that, because I suppose I felt personally, I thought, well, I mean, for a character to feature in a computer game is in some ways even harder often than a movie. Do you know what I mean? Computer games make a lot more money than movies, and so that was one aspect. And then, I mean, I think I felt or I still feel, where movies are concerned, that somehow, a bit like 2000 AD's characters, maybe the parade has gone by. I don't know. I mean, there used to be a time where every month a producer would ring me up or email me from Hollywood often and say, can I option martial law? And invariably the deal wouldn't be very good, and we'd have to turn them down, because you probably know that this whole world of optioning comic book characters is a jungle. And because Kevin and I have been around the block many times, we're not gonna get taken in. But there's always someone who tries. I mean, the classic one is they want a shopping agreement where they basically option your character for free, and then they can do what they like with it, or they can option it to someone, and then only then does money appear on the table. Well, that's obviously a no-no. But I know that they will try that on with, maybe younger creators who are desperate to get their, and invariably it doesn't work, because if you don't pay for something, it's not real. Once you've taken out a bank loan or something, it's real. So we used to have lots of inquiries, and there was a time where it was even, under strong consideration by Warner Brothers. But it's like everything's gone quiet, and everyone says, oh, it should happen because The Boys has been this very successful TV series. And I have no explanation for it. Maybe in the world we live in, martial law is that bit darker than The Boys. You know what I mean? Maybe it's a little, it's a bit more vicious, and the world we live in is, well, it's a bit of an uncomfortable place at the moment, isn't it? Everyone's very, very safe. So maybe martial law feels a bit too dangerous for today. I mean, if you think of things like, say, the Umbrella, is it the Umbrella Men or something? I mean, it's an excellent series, but it doesn't feel dangerous to me. And other fantasy series I think of, I don't think, that's not risking anything. But maybe martial law is just a bit too edgy, perhaps.
That's actually a very good point, because I long have wondered why we haven't seen it adapted. It seems like on so many levels it could work. Like, martial law is one of the very few properties that I do hear about getting optioned that I always hope something will happen, because You could do a great straight ahead adaptation where you're like panel for panel. You could do a great comedic adaptation of it, you know, where you lean more into the brevity of the series. You could make it a little bit more gritty and realistic. I think that probably Marshall and people are still very interested in it. You know, fans, people who like the series have stuck with it for all of these years, and I still hold out faith we'll see an adaptation of it someday.
I do too. Yeah, I mean, I had wondered for a while, but I think most people know this. I mean, although it's published by DC, I think most people who are kind of insiders know, or if not, I do let people know on social media from time to time. Kevin and I actually own the film rights to martial law, so it means that, you know, people can't go, oh, I thought that was with Warner Brothers, so I thought, you know, it would never happen. And but I think most insiders know that, you know, it's around, and yeah, and I don't think there's any. I mean, Warner Brothers seriously considered it. It was in their boardroom actually, and I think Kevin was actually there. He was in Los Angeles at the time, and but the timing of it could not have been worse, because it was just before Watchmen was released, and I think Warner Brothers probably would have already known that their response to Watchmen would be mixed. But that was a long, long time ago. My God, it's a lifetime ago. So I don't know. We'll see. You know, hope springs eternal, and it would certainly make a fantastic movie. I think everyone recognizes that. And as you say, there must be an awful lot of guys who grew up reading martial law who are now film directors or producers or something like that. And we did have a couple of. There was one actor who wanted to do it, and but the financial offer wasn't enough. It was too much of a homegrown product. It was a well-known an actor on a well-known fantasy movie, and also at one point, and maybe we were being a bit paranoid there. The Rock. Now, this was, I mean, as you know, now he's this huge box office character. But round about the time of the Warner Brothers interest, which was separate, we had at the exact same time, The Rock really wanted to do it. Now, this was at a point, which, as I say, I think our timing and our knowledge on this, I think, and don't say we need an agent, because we did have agents, and they weren't any bloody good either. I won't even go down the agent story. Yeah, let me think. This was at the time when The Rock was, what should we say, having a little bit of a dip in his career, or he was going in a different direction. I think he just made the film The Tooth Fairy or something like that. So that gives you an idea of the era, round about the same time as Watchmen coming out. And so there were two reasons why we said no. And we were quite bullish about this. I think I don't think we realized this isn't quite how things are done. You know, perhaps it almost reflects not just you know, martial law's character is equally fuck off and die kind of thing. There were two reasons why we said no. One was, apart from possibly because we were stupid, one was because he'd just done The Tooth Fairy, and we thought, and I think we were right, that the fans would have taken it personally and would have killed us if he'd gone ahead and been martial law. I don't know how they would have felt today, where he's this #1 box office character. Maybe they feel differently, but we were aware of what fans felt, and we thought they would have come after us personally, and maybe they would have done. So we thought maybe that's not a good idea. But the second reason was because he had first look at Disney, and Kevin, as I've described, knows all this wonderful stuff about Starlust and things like this. So he also knew an awful lot about Disney, or stuff you probably know of as well. But I know very little about them, other than they are or they were at least, maybe they still are, a very kind of Christian orientated kind of organization. I mean, how that squares with them owning Marvel characters, I have no idea. Anyhow, I think we were really concerned that if Disney got it, that they might take all the fire out of it. And actually, now I'm saying it out loud, it doesn't seem as stupid as as at first thought. I mean, you even hear horror stories, and I don't know how true they are. I know it's true in other areas of entertainment, where if you have something that might be a rival or something that people don't want or don't like, they will buy it to put it on the shelf. And I think we thought at the time, and I was reflecting on this recently, and think, oh, we're being a bit paranoid. But maybe we weren't, because people do things like that. If they don't like something, hey, let's option it and stick it on a shelf, and it will never see the light of day again. So maybe we were right to turn down The Rock and Disney.
No, when you first started that story, I was like, you are crazy. And then as soon as you said Disney First Look, I was like, ooh, wise man once said, because no, man, there is so much stuff. As a guy who, like, I wrote a couple of screenplays when I was young and dumb and full of vigor and stuff, and I sold them without an agent because I'm an absolute idiot. And yeah, and they stole them. And I saw some stuff. Oh yeah, they stole 3 of my scripts. I never got paid anything for them. And like when I talked to the lawyer, he was like, "You had no it." Okay, yeah, you get me $1 million, and we can get rolling on this pro bono case for you, so we can get boxing. And I'm like, okay, yeah, this is how stuff works. So as the more I got into comics, and the more I found out about all of this stuff that I always read about getting optioned, and all these people getting yanked out of the equation, and all this nasty stuff that happened, you definitely made the right call there, in my opinion.
Oh, I'm pleased about that. Oh, you've made my day. Thanks for that, Roman. That's yeah, because you know we thought subsequently maybe we should have just taken the money and run, but yeah, it's a hard one. It's a hard one, and a lot depends on how hungry you are, and I think certainly. I don't think Kevin and I are that hungry anymore. So, but we would have been tempted at the time. Money was tight and all the rest of it. The other story, of course, while I think of it, which you may already know about, in which case I don't have to elaborate on it. Did you know about the proposed martial law Batman crossover?
I have heard about it, but there is a lot of mistruths and half rememberings out there on the internet. If you would care to share some details about that, I would love it.
Well, what happened was Kevin was at San Diego and bumped into, who's that brilliant artist who is or was some kind of president at DC, the one who does great anatomy.
Jim Lee.
Jim Lee, that's it, yeah. And bumped into Jim Lee. And I think Jim was sort of trying to do new things with, so that kind of gives you an idea of the era. We're probably going back about 8 years or something. And he said to Kevin, how would you guys like to do a martial law Batman crossover? And I think Kevin thought, oh, this is not for real. You know what I mean? This is, yeah, really? I mean, not to mention, well, we've already sort of done it. Anyway, so I think what Jim was doing was to sort of bring some new energy and some new thinking into DC, which is always an endemic problem with any comic organization that's been around for so long. It can get a little, a bit weighty, shall we say. So, and they kept insisting on it. And so we said, well, Kevin and I knew right at the beginning, we said, this is never going to happen. you know, in other words, we knew that somewhere down the line, they were going to pull the plug on it. But obviously, being who we are and having that kind of mischievous way of looking at things, we thought, well, we've got to give it a try. So I wrote a synopsis, which was very safe, and it featured from memory, I can't remember the villain's name, but he was someone who could travel through endless dimensions, and he was killing endless Batmans in other dimensions, obviously alternative Batmen. And we thought, because they were alternative Batmen, that this would be okay. In other words, it's not the real Batman, folks, you know, it's one from Earth 55. And yeah, they okayed the synopsis, and let me see. Yeah, I think we got a contract. I think we signed a contract, and then there was this long delay after that, and that's what we thought. Yeah, and I think maybe there was a change of thinking or regime at DC, and so anyway, eventually they said, yeah, it was a very brief synopsis because it had to be to keep it safe. In other words, yeah, it would be this kind of respectful story. And so then I did a longer version. And Kevin and I talked over the story, and there were some wonderful ideas in it. And I'll come back to them in a moment. Again, I will go into some of the content of it because there were one or two highlights on it. And so we worked out the whole story, and then I did a kind of safe synopsis version of it. It wasn't safe enough, unfortunately. They saw through us. But I mean, to be fair, I mean, you know, if you said to Robert Crumb, we want you to do such and such, you would expect you would get Robert Crumb. So if you ask Kevin O'Neill and Pat Mills to do a Marshal Law meets Batman, what do you expect? So I think it was, yeah, it was a little foolish. But so anyway, so I sent in this version, and then they said, I can't remember their exact words, but it was something like, we've changed our mind. You know, Batman is now moving in a different direction to the original direction. And I think what that meant in practical terms was that one thing they do not want is someone taking the piss out of Batman, which they would have definitely got. So that was the end of that, really. And but there were some wonderful moments in it, like this guy, I can't remember what he's, as I say, I've forgotten his name now, the villain, but he was bringing through lots of different Batmen and killing them. So Kevin visualized a pile of maybe 100 or more Batmen, all dead, with killed by this guy. So Marshal Law is obviously, he's not doing anything disrespectful. It's the villain who's doing it. I mean, after all, the Joker does disrespectful things. Why, you know, it's this idea that the hero becomes above criticism and above reproach. I think it's a little bit like, oh, you can never say anything bad about Mother Teresa kind of thing. Well, you can actually. There's things you can say. And I think it's like Batman has almost reached that kind of sainthood level. So there were lots of Batmen. There was a great pile of Robins as well, you know, dead Robins. And then there were, and significantly and subtly, or maybe not so subtly, there was only 2 or 3 girlfriends of Bruce Wayne. You know, lots of Robins and just 2 or 3 girlfriends. And there was a lot of that kind of stuff in it. And in our version, I think Thomas Wayne was actually an arms manufacturer, which would make sense because Bruce Wayne is now, I think, or he certainly seems to have all the latest Kevlar and God knows what. And so Thomas Wayne was a very sinister arms manufacturer, and he was trying to be charitable to the South America again, actually. And this was based on a real thing that Kevin and I witnessed, which I can't be more specific about for that reason. But it was a charity event that Kevin and I both attended. And so we did a twisted version of it where Thomas Wayne, or maybe it was Batman himself, I can't remember, is a free bat kite for every poor child in the ghettos and barrios of South America. And so they're all going around with these bat kites. And that was based on a charity event that Kevin and I were at, where we're some quite well-known celebrities. And at the time we were looking at it and thinking, we've got to get a fucking story out of this. This is brilliant. We've got to, it was so, what should we say, top heavy, that rich philanthropist patronizing the poor, which didn't sit well with either of us. So there was lots of that kind of thing going on. And it was actually a good story. And, it had all the classic elements of martial law. And I think it would have been, and I think Kevin would have drawn it beautifully and satirically. But we made sure that martial law did not have some kind of brutal fight with Batman himself. In other words, they tended to be more on the same side. And that's why we rather stupidly thought, hey, we might just get away with this. Not a chance. Not a chance.
That's so sad, man. I've heard stories, and the big story that goes around is it was just far too extreme and was tossed out. I think more of the reality of the situation is that Jim Lee did have full intentions of following through on that story. And then the upper echelon of DC got wind of things and stuff got a little bit more serious, and Lee might have not been allowed to follow through on that.
I think that's roughly what happened. Yeah, he wanted to bring it. I mean, it would have come out under one of their alternative imprints or something. So it there's no. But yeah, I think at that point, maybe also from a movie point of view, Batman may have been going through a bit of a dip or something, and so they needed to come back to brass tacks to make it really serious. And the days where you could have slightly humorous Batman and Robin stories long gone, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I suppose it does come down to being in the right place at the right time. And on that occasion, we were in the wrong place. But it was fun. I mean, I didn't mind it too much. And I don't think Kevin did either, because we said to ourselves, this is probably not going to happen. But hey, we owe it to our readers and to ourselves to give it a shot, just in case it will.
I'm glad you guys gave it a shot. Maybe one day, God willing, when DC pulls their head out of their butt, we'll be able to talk on it. Hey, Kevin, you know how we said we weren't going to do anymore? Well, see, the thing is with Batman. But, so, things have kind of wound down, I think, for martial law as an ongoing series, obviously. There's not going to be anything else big that happens with it. But when I read about it being optioned, I always hear something very interesting that I wanted to bring up here, is that usually even when a project is creator owned, one person is the creative spearhead, and they basically are the bull in the china shop knocking stuff over. But I've always heard you say that if anything were to ever happen, it would only happen with both of you being given input into the series and the product to come out. Have you guys ever thought about pursuing that now that, Kevin has reached a point in his career, obviously, where he's retired? You're still extremely busy, though, which I kind of want to ask you about here in just a second.
Sure.
Have you guys ever thought about really pursuing that and trying to getting it adapted, or is it just kind of something that's
I,
on the table if it happens?
well, the thing is, we actually we've had two types of agents, and I mentioned that briefly before. We had one really famous Hollywood agency, and they were the ones who got it up to the boardroom, and the director they had in mind, who was hot at that time and probably is not hot anymore, because unfortunately directors seem to come and go. It was McGee, and this was just before he brought out his Terminator film, from memory. So we thought, well, with this agency behind us, things will happen, and it didn't. And then we tried another agency, I think that's another Hollywood agency, and they didn't seem to be getting anywhere with the character. And then in a different capacity, we tried a British agent, and because these other ones were such hot shots, somehow that didn't seem to help. So we tried a cold shot one at the bottom of the heap, if you like, and that didn't work either. So I think I can remember Kevin and I saying, look, what's the point of staying with an agent? And we had tried over the years various agents. I can remember it has a perspective, because that's one of the ways you get things through, as you said yourself, with your own screenplays. Should you go with an agent or shouldn't you? And so we actually tried at one point. I used some contacts to get an introduction to a really famous British agency that had strong connections with the States. And she wrote back and said, blah, 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 but sorry, but you're not famous enough. So we're not going to entertain you. And so then a few years went by, and I think we had a couple of things, I don't know, that gave us a higher status, shall we say. And so I wrote to her again, and she said, sorry, you're still not famous enough. So you can, I mentioned this to explain, if anyone's wondering, why don't we use an agent? Well, those stories and many others explain why I just got so fed up with agents, and we said, you know what, this is because it's time consuming, because they'll give you a whole load of hype, and they'll say, yeah, we're really going to do this, and blah, blah, blah. And they raise your hopes, and you kind of just get lost in their bullshit. So then I think we went alone. We went and sort of tried it on our own for a while. And I think to do that requires a lot of effort. And I think it also helps if you either move in those circles or you are actually in Los Angeles. I think it helps so that you talk to someone who talks to someone, and you're networking. And I think we're both of us in different ways. Kevin has, as far as I know, really retired from all this stuff, and I'm geographically in Spain, which I like very much. It's a lovely part of the world. And it's a lot cheaper than living in LA. And probably a lot less polluted and everything. So, and I don't want it that badly. I think you've got to want it really badly. I mean, if I knew of someone who knew of someone who knew a director, then of course, I have quite a strong presence on social media. And whenever something comes up, I do interact on it and so on. I mean, for example, Duncan Jones is a keen fan of Slain. And should 2000 AD's character Rogue Trooper ever get made into a movie, and I rather have my doubts, but if it ever happens, I know he'd be interested in making a kind of studio Slain film. So and I know a few other film directors as well. And actually, funnily enough, and this is going back a few years now, we did have an inquiry from a major British production company who are saying, is martial law, the rights available? So you go, yeah, let's hear from you. Because you're thinking, hey, they're Brits, they'll understand where we're at and all the rest of it. And then it suddenly goes cold again. And that's the problem, I think, with this, is that you've got to devote a lot of your life to this up and down. And the alternative, I think, is one that we've gone for, which is to say, if anyone's really keen, they'll come to us. Oh, and of course, that's another thing that can happen on martial law. And we've had to turn down about 2 or 3 examples of this, is you often get independent film directors who want to make a kind of punk, avant-garde, almost art house martial law. And that's going to please nobody. I mean, it's not quite as bad as Disney, but it's not far off, because your regular, we figure, and you'll probably bear this out, we figure martial law fans are really going to want something that's, if not a studio job, a big independent production. They're going to want to see all this come alive. They're not going to want to see something made for, let's say, I don't know, 10 million or something. They want to see the thing really happen. So that's another one that we had to turn down. We got at least 3 inquiries from that direction, which is a bit heartbreaking for them, because they're real martial law fans, but we can't go down that avant-garde road. So yeah, they've got to kind of pass an entrance exam. We've got to look at their CV and say. So I think both Kevin and I, in different ways, have kind of given up, at least given up on promoting the idea of it. I still let people know it's around, and it's possible maybe in 2 years' time, if this where it features in a computer game, that could well give it the boost it actually needs, because there's a whole generation of people who barely know who the character is. But what I think visually, he's still as strong as ever. I mean, when you look at him, you think, my God, who is this guy? I mean, I think there was, just as I'm reflecting on this, is bringing back memories of it. There was a film out where I think I actually spoke to the artist involved, and he said he was influenced by martial law, but that's fair enough. And I don't think it was I don't think it eroded martial law in any way. I think it's been and gone now. A film called Officer Down. Does that mean anything to you? Yeah. Now, I remember speaking years ago to whoever created that. I think it was for Image, and he said there was a martial law influence there. But I think martial law is strong enough to stand on its own. And similarly, where The Boys is concerned, I think martial law says something different to The Boys, as far as I can tell, and therefore, if The Boys does well.
Yeah, so, we were talking about stuff getting kicked around in Hollywood and how that's just kind of at this time, if it happens, wonderful. But I think you do have a lot of very valid points in that while stuff like The Boys has definitely opened the door for martial law, I think it has something very different to say. And I'm very, very curious to see given what people are making of comic media at this point, and it being allowed to be truer and truer to source material, there's a lot of potential for a lot of stuff you've written, but martial law in particular. I've seen a big rise in popularity over the past few years of martial law as well, where people of my generation, it's on a level with. Have you heard of the King Hell Heroica cycle or anything? Max Immortal. It's a series Rick Each here in the U.S., but it's another. It's not like martial law, but it is in the sense that it's a very unique take on the perspective of superheroes. There's been a big push. Max Immortal's back in print now, and it's coming back out after like 10 years. And I constantly have people asking me about martial law. So it's nice to finally be able to wrap up some of these loose ends and be able to give some people some closure to some of this stuff. We were talking, and you mentioned that you have got something going on right now that you're working on, which is actually very reminiscent of like 2000 AD and a lot of the stuff that you cut your teeth on. Can you tell my viewers a little bit about what you got cooking?
Sure. Okay, well, let me show you the cover first of all. So there it is. It's called Space Warp. And the thing is, if your viewers aren't and your listeners aren't that familiar with 2000 AD, they'll be wondering, well, what's Space Warp all about? And Space Warp is basically the early 2000 ADs, right? Appealed to 12-year-olds was the average thing. And 2000 AD grew up with its audience. So the majority of people who read it today are probably in their 50s. So what they're looking for from a comic is very different to what a 12-year-old wants. So Space Warp is about getting back to those 12-year-olds. And it's similar to 2000 AD in many respects in terms of stories and so on. But what I wanted, it has one very important difference, is it's creator owned. So in other words, all the stories in it are jointly owned by writer and artist. In other words, to put it another way, it's if we have the chance to do 2000 AD again and to do it properly, this is how I would want to do it. And it's interesting trying to reach those 12-year-olds because two things I discovered. First of all, Generation Z has a unique style all of its own. And when we've reached them, when we've found readers of that age, they like Space Warp. There's no question of that. It works for them. But of course, you don't reach them in the same way that we all did years ago on 2000 AD and so on. They're actually a hard audience to find. And we think we've made some success in that direction. The other thing that's interesting about it is that some 50-year-old comic fans, at least, are kind of disappointed that it's not for them. But of course it is. It's it's like James Bond is for everyone. You can be 12 years old and enjoy James Bond, and you can be 50, you can be my age and enjoy James Bond. So, but nevertheless, the emphasis is on that readership, and it applies in particular because younger readers want things, they want lots of action and they want it very intense. As we get older, we slow down in every way. I probably won't, some 50-year-olds probably won't thank me for that, but the story is still fast-paced. 12-year-olds, they don't want talking heads for too long. They want lots of action, lots of excitement, and they want to be drawn into the story. And so there are things, and of course there are things that are different to very different to 2000 AD. We have our own, if you like, rivals to Judge Dredd, but it also reflects the different times we live in. So one of the heroes or anti-heroes, if you like, is an influencer. He has an influencer on, digital media and so on. And so he has a huge number of followers. And so the cops who are after him have to kind of, they try and track him down through digital media and so on. He's actually escaped from hell. So he's hot visually as a kind of pin-up, and he's also hot as as he's escaped from hell. So that's one of the stories in there. And I mean, I could flick through it, but it's a little bit of a hard thing to, just dip in and out of a comic in that way. But you will see from the artwork that it is, well, in many senses, I would say the standard of artwork generally is probably higher than early 2000 AD, with the notable exception, obviously, of Carlos Esquera's design on Judge Dredd and so forth. And so it reflects, if you like, some things that I think are very much 2021. So here, for example, we have this story, Jurassic Punks. And it's set in Liverpool, in a post-apocalyptic Liverpool. Now, that, if you like, is, I think, one of the major differences to how we would have done it in original 2000 AD, because whenever you had a post-apocalyptic story, it had to be New York, right? Or maybe Los Angeles, certainly not where you are, and certainly not it's got to be New York. And now there's a recognition that, Liverpool is an incredible city, has amazing architecture, as you can see here. This is the Liver building. And so there's a reflection of what you might call some 2021 elements, because I really felt, and you have the same problem in the States, that a lot of 12-year-olds aren't reading comics. They might go and watch Marvel movies, but they ain't reading comics. I think you've almost got the same problem for similar reasons, that your readership has grown up with the comics. And so your average 50-year-old or even 60-year-old knows everything about the X-Men and so on, and who they are and how they interact and all the rest of it. But a 12-year-old doesn't know or doesn't care. In other words, because probably, and I'm guessing, that the stories are designed to appeal to a long-term fan. And so what I have in my mind when I'm writing stories for Space Warp is, how do I appeal to a 12-year-old who's never heard of me, isn't interested, he just wants to read a good story? And that's really challenging. It's very, very creative, because it cuts through all the bullshit. You know what I mean? If they don't like it, they're going to, and 12-year-olds can be quite blunt and quite cruel. So I like that for myself, and I've always liked this as a direction. I never thought it would really focus me this much, but if I had to choose, I would choose, that's the audience I would go for, because they're the next generation. And if I can influence them, for me, subversion is important. I don't know why. As I say, some people, making money is important, or I don't know, writing Spider-Man is important. It's like that's their goal in life. For me, for whatever reason, challenging the status quo. I think in other areas we have, and you doubtless have film directors in the States. We have Ken Loach in Britain, and his work challenges the status quo. And we have other film directors who do. But in comics, it's like challenging authority is not as strong today as it once was. And bear in mind, you guys in the States started it off with your underground comics, and the Silkwood thing. You probably know that the underground comics are what led to the Silkwood movie and everything else, because they were the first to expose this terrible crime. So I'm assuming that Last Gasp, or whoever it was that did this, probably had I think they had other stories as well. You had this wonderful tradition, And then it kind of moved into Warren Comics, which is also fantastic, but was more fantasy. And now I think you're much more polarized into superheroes. So Space Warp is about trying to get back to that. It's a single issue at the moment, and that'll be followed up with others later. And it's available on Space Warp. Wait a minute. Do you know, I've got to look it up. I forgot. It shows I'm not trying to shove this down everyone's throat every day. Yeah, my wife is saying spacewarpcomic.com is where you can get it, and it's available as a digital. In other words, you can download it onto your Kindle or whatever. And we also hope we're starting to get distribution via Diamond into American comic shops. So that's starting to happen. It's probably quite patchy to begin with because it's a big country and you've got the whole COVID thing and so on. But that's a direction I really want to go. And what's important is that it's worked so far commercially, because all the artists and myself had to take a jump into the unknown. In other words, is this going to work? And we've had a strong enough financial return on it to be able to pay the artists and so on. And as I say, they're going to be they are joint owners in the enterprise, and it will still be, hopefully it will still be selling years from now, because it's different to that rather brutal newsstand selling, where it appears on the newsstand and then it's gone and it's finished. With modern publishing and self-publishing, you have so much more control, and might be relevant to whatever you're doing yourself. You can self-publish now, and it's surprising how few people are using print on demand. I know one or two are doing it in the States. As far as I know, I think we're the only ones who are doing print on demand in the UK. So this is print on demand, and as you can see, it's a glossy cover, and excuse me, it works. And we've been able to branch out because we've made enough money from print on demand, which doesn't involve any capital outlay. I mean, most people, if they're going to publish their own comics, they say, okay, we're going to do a print run of, say, 2,000 or 3,000, and we're going to pay for a printer. With print on demand, you don't have that. There's no capital outlay. And having done that and made money that way, we're now able to move on and also do cheaper print runs with a printer as well. So we're making progress, but it's what we're discovering, as always, is it's a long job. There's a lot of work involved in being editor, publisher, writer, and marketeer. You have to market this material as well. So it's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, it is an incredible amount of work. I can tell you, just from the little amount that I do dealing with that kind of stuff, it's insane. And that leads me to my last question, the final thing that I'd like to ask you about. Whenever I talk to people that are from my generation or a little bit prior, I like to ask about the proliferation of digital technology and how that's affected not just the distribution of books, because I think that's mostly been positive. Digital books are a good thing. I like physically holding a book. I need that, but allowing books to be perpetually in print digitally for a reasonable price anywhere in the world at any time is an absolutely incredible and indispensable thing that is happening to the industry right now. However, there's a large dynamic shift that has happened as comics are no longer assembled, drawn, done by hand, and it works very much in tandem with, and you've been so intrinsically tied with running and producing material for such a length of time. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on how things have changed as far as interaction and the actual creation of a book from the bottom up, and how that's been a good or a bad thing, and the good and the bad that you see in there.
Right. Well, with 2000 AD is still in existence today. It doesn't sell as it once did, but it's still going. But it still applies the same rules as the past, but without, in my view, the same fire that was once there. In other words, you've got that kind of energy around things, and that has to, I think all publishers have to have a certain, I think this is relevant to the top down or the bottom up, as it were. I think there's got to be a certain amount of high energy, what we would call in Britain anyway, a kind of punk quality to it. It's a kind of dangerous quality. And I somehow, I know Marvel have made the transition where movies are concerned very successfully, and DC, but I kind of get the feeling that that corporate quality that comes into their work with Disney and Warner Brothers and so on, I don't think it's a very good thing for comics. I think you need that energy. And what I think's happened in the past is that you've had individuals there, and the same would be true for me on 2000 AD, because that was part of a giant corporation, International Publishing Corporation. And so you have these individuals who have a kind of anti-establishment attitude, if you like, and so even though it's part of a giant corporation, it feels like a cottage industry. So a good example of that would be, say, Karen Berger on with Vertigo, where I'm sure everyone concerned who was working for her felt like they were a separate, you know, that they had this kind of intimacy, but you still had the machine that was going to drive it forward, and it worked for quite a few years. And similarly, you had Archie. So you felt you were working for Archie. You felt Epic was something other, you know, and it was working on its own, even though it had this giant engine of Marvel behind it. And when Archie moved on, I think that would have been a key factor in it fading away into the sunset. I think when you had those kind of epic heavy hitters or whatever they were called, I remember being involved with those. It wasn't quite the same. There's a certain, I think you have these individuals. So whether they work for a small publisher or whether they front a large company, and it was the same with myself on 2000 AD. I'm sure people who were working for me on 2000 had no sense of this giant corporation behind it. And I think that's the way to go. If you know, there've got to be advantages to having a big machine behind you, as long as you have creative freedom. I think that seems to be less likely today. Things seem much more corporate now. Maybe it's just a phase, or maybe that's how it's going to be forever. Now, if it's going to be how it is forever, you're going to get more people like myself who are going to be self-publishing. I mean, what I'm doing is not unique. I think what is unique is that I'm aiming at kids and I'm going print on demand. Most people are probably aiming for their peers, people they meet at comic conventions and so on. That's not my objective. And as I say, I've even had a little bit of hostility from those older fans who are saying, why do you want to do this? Well, because that's the next generation. And you know, you think that's where the next Garth Ennis is going to come from, or whatever, you know, some new kid on the block. But you've got to create that energy to allow them to come through. And if I seem a little evangelical on it, I think it's probably something quite normal that, or maybe normal for some of us at least, is that you want to put something back into the industry. Do you know what I mean? You know, and you've acquired all this knowledge. And when you realize, for me, 2000 AD, it has many strengths today, but for me, it's too corporate for my taste today. and I think we've more or less gone our separate ways. But at the same time, you know, it's like any craftsman, you acquire all these skills, and most of them, some of them will be dated. In other words, some of them will no longer apply to today's generation, but a good story will always apply. And those rules that you learn, how to appeal to a 12-year-old, I mean, it's the same rules that apply to Dickens on Oliver Twist. Do you know what I mean? It's not like, oh, well, that's 20 years ago or 30 years ago. If you can get good story and if you can get good art, they're fairly eternal. And so not to put something back into the industry is, you know, it's something I feel I have to do. So it's one of the reasons why, for example, I did this story, Be Pure, Be Vigilant, Behave, which is about secret history of 2000 AD. I've done a similar one on Slain, and maybe if I can fit it in with everything else, I might even do maybe a kind of comic equivalent of Robert McKee's story. You're doubtless familiar with Robert McKee, and you know he's my Bible when it comes to film writing. And I think there are skills there which often get lost. I mean, my advice to comic writers, in the absence of me writing anything like that, and I can't think of anyone else who is quite that way inclined, is look at Robert McKee's story, because although his style can be a bit hectoring in places, you know, they're all the rules of drama that never change, and I think they're often lost. And you know, we've seen this over the years. I mean, you had some great stories from Vertigo, but you also had some that I think you could describe as talking head comics, and that's only going to appeal to a specialist audience or an art house audience. And I mean, people say, for example, I mean, I also work for France. You know, I've got one series, a couple of series actually there, one of which is a bestseller called Requiem, which is actually available. And most of our audience for the digital version is from the States, where you're much kinder about digital artwork. The French are not, and the Brits say, no, it's got to be paper. But that audience is huge. French comics, I mean, they'll tell you that things are not going as well as they used to. But that's actually because there's so many comics on the market, they flood the comic shops. So so what you have, and it happened to me a few years ago, you have a Hollywood opening weekend. You know, in other words, your book comes out in that comic shop in Paris and other leading cities. And if it doesn't sell in the opening weekend, you are dead. So it's a bit brutal, but French comics. The point I'm making is the 12-year-old French kids and 10-year-olds. They start with Asterix, and then they get up to 18, and they're reading my series Requiem, Vampire Knight, or whatever it is. And so the argument is always, the reason British comics have declined, which they certainly have, is because of video games and other things like that. And I'm sure the same argument is used in the States. But my response to that is, then why is it that French kids who are 10 and 12 love books? And of course, and this applies to the States and to the UK, why are 12-year-old kids in the States and 12-year-old kids in the UK, why are they reading manga? Because what's happened is, and it isn't just manga, I know there's lots of other things as well, but they're alternatives to Marvel and DC, and here in the UK, alternatives to 2000 AD. In other words, they're saying, okay, I can't find what I'm looking for because the story's a bit too adult, or it's a bit boring, or there's too many talking heads, or everyone's talking about X-Men and I don't know who they are. So they just go and buy a manga instead. And that's, So I don't accept this idea. And for me, obviously, you know, coming up to retirement age, it's a sad thing to think, well, when I started, comics are really booming, and now there's still opportunities and all the rest of it, but they're no longer reaching that audience that gave me a living for a lifetime. So, you know, that's why I feel I have to put something back. And so Space Warp is an attempt to do that, to say, well, I've got to pass something on, and also to show that we can reach those 12-year-olds. I believe we can. If manga can reach it, and they're Japanese, why, surely to God, we must be able to reach them with our own culture, our own story styles as well. So that's where I'm at.
May you live to be 1,000 and never retire, my friend. I swear. No, I love comics. I love the medium. I love so many people involved with the industry. And growing up, I lived through the 90s implosion here in the United States. And I was just coming past the implosion of the 80s at DC. And I've heard people talk doom and gloom about the industry for my entire life. It's going to disappear. We're not going to have it in 5 years. And it's 5 years. And oh, well, 5 years from now it'll be, and then 5 years. But the thing that people fundamentally miss, even when they're making plays like now, where I do feel like some of the larger companies are at least cognizant and trying to appeal to a younger audience, they have no concept of who they're writing for anymore. And they, even when they're shooting for that 12-year-old audience, they wouldn't even know where to begin. And it seems like you, throughout your career, have based characters on people. You've consulted real life events. You've paid attention to the world around you, how it's changed and it's evolved. And that is absolutely incredible. I cannot commend you enough for it. And I cannot wait to see how that feeds into the new magazine. I'm just really looking forward to it. That is an extremely positive outlook, and leaving the
Yeah,
world a little bit
thank you.
better than you leave it, or than when you found it, is a profound statement for me. So
Yeah, I mean, comics are so important. I mean, I'm so aware of how they change people's lives, and the idea that, you know, French children can enjoy them, and British children can't to the same degree, and American children can't to the same degree that they once did. That just seems so awful. And of course, when I was a kid myself, I did read comics from time to time, but I always took it for granted. It was just like television or radio or something. It was just always there. So it's quite chilling to find you've reached a point where you think, actually, they may not be there tomorrow, unless we do something, or even worse, they become a middle-aged man's pleasure. You know, and that, in other words, they become a hobby thing. And of course, there are some hobbyists who would like it that way. They'll never actually spell it out, but I always get the feeling sometimes it's like, well, they used to be for kids, but they're for us now, so they can bugger off. And you're thinking, hang on a minute, that's like kids playing football and some older guy coming along and saying, hey, I'm going to have your football now. No, get your own football. So yeah, it's an important thing to do. And well, the great thing about being, you know, self-publisher is your ass is on the line, so you've got to make it work. You know what I mean? You haven't got a choice. You know, there's no case of, oh, well, never mind that, I'll go on and do something else. No, you've got to give it your best shot. And it's working. I mean, it's working partly, of course, because of the support of older fans. But every time I get a comment, a tweet, or a letter from a younger reader, I pounce on them and say, yeah, what did you think? Tell me what you like. And myself and my wife Lisa, we analyze these letters from 12-year-olds or even 10-year-olds, and we look very carefully at what is it they're saying. And I don't think there's anything miraculous about that. That's what I used to do. When I started Battle and Action and 2000 AD, at that time, as I described to you earlier, they were saying in the 70s exactly what they're saying today. Comics are finished. It's over. The golden age is in the past. The golden ages are always in the past. It's never in the present. And that's why I was so, I spent so much time reading readers' feedback. And we actually had something that you wouldn't have the equivalent of in the States. We actually had vote charts. We had graphs which showed the success and failure of individual stories. That's incredibly eccentric, but and I have to say, hated by fans, because and the reason it was hated by fans was because it told you the truth. It didn't say, you know, you could have fans who are saying, hey, this story is brilliant, and then you look at it on the vote chart, you think, no, it wasn't. The readers hated that episode, and you actually got what you were told to do, what you asked the readers to do on a weekly comic, so that the logistics are different to States. You said to them, tell us what you like and dislike every week. So you'd say, so a typical voting cast might be, my #1 story was Judge Dredd, tick, so up it goes, right? My second story, let's say, was Slain, so that goes up a bit as well. And then I didn't like such and such a story, so that goes down. And so after a while, you had these kind of elaborate graphs that could show you exactly which episode they liked, and it wouldn't take long to work out why. So we all tended to study these things like market researchers. But of course, they were often disliked by fans because they would say, with some validity, yeah, it's only the 10-year-olds who fill in those vote coupons. We older readers, we wouldn't do that. So you even had, and I mean, I think I mentioned this in my latest book, Kiss My Axe. You had these situations where Judge Dredd, everyone knew it was a colossal success, but it went through a dip with the readers. And because everyone was concerned, you know what's coming next, everyone was concerned that the readers might give Judge Dredd the thumbs down. They rigged the votes. So you have kind of presidential election corruption going on. And but I always took the view, I would rather the votes of the readers dictate things, you know. And so the equivalent today is, if I get in a letter from a 12-year-old and he says, well, I like this story, but I didn't think that story was any good because I thought it was too complicated or something like that, I will really sit and look at what he has to say and think, okay, I'm going to have to do better next time. And whereas with older, more sophisticated fans, I realize it's much more subjective. It's a matter of taste and all the rest of it. But what we found on 2000 AD was the more, what shall I say, the more sophisticated stories did not go down so well with the readers. And after a while, those voting charts were done away with and they were ignored. And I'm sure if you were to look at it, you would probably find that's roughly around that period where 2000 AD sales started to dip, because they were no longer following the readers. They were following fans who would be an important spokespeople and everything, but they didn't represent the majority. I would say maybe at that point they were 30% of our readership, but the bulk of readers were still what we would, the equivalent of what you used to have in the States. they were newsstand readers. In other words, they bought the comic on the newsstand. They didn't go into a comic shop because we didn't have the complexity of comic shops that you had or maybe still have in the States. We had some, they would be in every major city, but they weren't drawing in the same number as newsstands. So one of the things, for example, with Space Warp is, and I'm delighted to say this, we've actually got it out on the newsstand, which is, yeah, it's it's a long story how we got it there, but it is possible to get it on the newsstand, which means that there will be people who will be looking at it who would never go in a comic shop, and they'll look at it and they'll say, yeah, I like the look of that, I'll give it a shot.
When you talk to anybody, any industry professional, anybody who came up in the industry, any fan, if they are over 30, they will tell you, they're like, man, when I first picked up that comic, and I love stopping them, and I'm like, where was that at? And they will always stop, and they'll stroke their chin for a second, and they're like, well, my old comic shop used to, actually, that was at the, and then they go back to that butcher's shop or that drugstore, that spinner rack, that newsstand where they found that book. And that's where that love of comics started. And that is something that we have absolutely abandoned inside of the industry. And I think it is one of the things that is, will be, if we do not stop ignoring it, will be the demise of comic books.
Yeah, yeah.
I highly applaud you, sir.
Yeah, it's an important thing because some comic shops are fine and are great, but others, as I'm sure it's exactly the same in the States, they can be elitist. So people, you know, a 12-year-old kid can actually feel a bit intimidated. It's fair enough if he's an expert or if he's a geek, right? But say he's just, I don't know, he's just thought, oh, I'll check out this comic shop. And he finds people are talking incredibly knowledgeably about things, and they may even be disapproving of whatever it is he wants to buy. I mean, I've had that experience where I went into Forbidden Planet in London with a friend because she said, oh, show me whatever it is you're currently working on. It was with an artist called Clint Langley. And the girl behind the counter didn't know the particular book. So she consulted the expert, you know, the fanboy supremo, you can imagine, right? Very black t-shirt. And he said, Clint Langley, never heard of him, and walked off. You're thinking, wait a minute, you know, you must have his books here. But at that point in time, it was like, no, if I'd said, I don't know, an American superhero book, he might have reacted differently, you know, or so there's this kind of elitism. I mean, I'd like to think that we've gone through that phase and people are just a bit more grown up about things, because it shouldn't be a personal taste. You know, it's whatever's going to sell, however you're going to reach kids in whatever way. So it's a nice challenge. I'm enjoying it.
Well, I commend you for undertaking the challenge. I did a video on Darwin Cook not too long ago, and he espoused a lot of the same notions, and he was really thrown under the bus by everybody he worked with. Marvel and DC ravenously took advantage of him and did some absolutely horrendous stuff that I had never known about. And it seems like the major thing that they took contention with is that he was upset that they were writing for, you know, 30 to 50-year-old fanboys and not trying to appeal whatsoever to that 12-year-old reader. So as someone who has spent his entire life contributing to the industry, played an incomparable role in my life as well as many others, thank you from the bottom of my heart for not only producing what you have, but continuing with your love and passion for the medium. It has been an absolute pleasure and an honor speaking with you, man. At every turn, you have absolutely blown me away with your continual knowledge of the industry, which is incredible. Most people I talk to do not have a grasp on who's reading books, what people want to see. They can't take feedback. They don't want anybody else involved, and everything that you talk about is are like the major points that are tearing the industry apart. If people could just listen.
Well, that's very, very kind of you. And thank you so much for that. And lovely talking to you. And don't forget, if you have lost the 3 hours, we'll do a 1 hour special a bit later on. All right?
I was gonna say, man, I'm excited. It finished processing, so as soon as we're done here, I'm gonna go check it, and I've got fingers crossed we didn't lose it, because I mean, thank you so much. This has been an incredible.
Don't worry. Don't worry. Okay, my friend. Speak again soon.
You have a great day, man. Thanks for joining me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If you did like what you saw, make sure you hit that like button. Think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know. Share these videos with your friends, and if you really enjoyed what you saw, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you never miss another video or premiere again. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of behind-the-scenes posts, updates, uncut interviews, and other exclusive content, including your name in the credits. If you want to support the channel but Patreon is not your thing, have no fear. There are also links to my Ko-Fi page where you can make one-time donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel, or you can finally use the join button right here on YouTube. That's right, after 2 years of fighting with AdSense, I can finally offer you membership here on YouTube. All you have to do is hit that little join button to make sure you check out the different tiers for the perks that fit you best. If that's not enough, there's also links to an Amazon list that you can use to donate research material for future episodes, as well as equipment that the channel needs, and you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen right now, as well as tons of other merch using the links in the description below. As always, this episode was brought to you by the Jerk Broadcasting System, as well as generous grants from the patrons, Ko-Fi, and YouTube members you see on the screen now. I'd also like to personally thank my loyal Wednesday Warriors, Adam Coburn, Channel 10, Mike Dolan, Super Chasen, David Arroyo, John Utley, Luke Anderson, and Mike Dolan again. You wonderful people make these videos possible, and I cannot thank you enough for the support of this channel. I cannot wait to see where the next year takes this channel with the help of amazing people such as yourselves. Thanks again for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed, maybe even learned something, and as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops, and keep reading comics.